Hey everybody, I'm Chris.
And I'm Brian.
And Brian's biblical history skeptic, and I'm just joining him tonight for right now.
We all know who the real star of the show is.
And I've got an echo, of course. Why? I can. Every single time I host, there's always an echo. Every single time. And today, though, we are joined by the great and powerful Tim O'Neill, also known in Carrier Land as Mr. Ass Crank himself.
a title I wear with some pride. G'day, guys. How are you?
Well, thanks for having us. And to join us, we have Tim O'Neill, atheist skeptic, rationalist, member of the Atheist Foundation of Australia, trained in the historical primary source method, as well as studied historiography, drawing on over 35 years of study of history of Christianity and Western religion. Tim O'Neill, how are you, sir?
I'm very well on this fine Sunday morning.
Yes, and what a fine Sunday morning it is. And so basically, Mr. Neal, if you could just tell us, basically, about growing up and about what schools you went to, what got you into history.
Sure. Okay, so grew up in Tasmania, which is, for those who don't know Australian geography, is the southernmost state here in Australia. It's quite a small place. I think probably the American equivalent would be, I don't know, Rhode Island, something along those lines. It was a pretty idyllic, middle class, happy upbringing. I was raised a Christian, and my parents were quite devout. But the interesting thing is that my father was a scientist and was very much a rationalist about everything, including religion, apart from his religion. So he managed to sort of compartmentalize things mentally somehow, a trick I never quite learned. So he taught us to be pretty skeptical. I mean, when I was a kid, I was right into ghost stories. I used to love ghost stories. I remember telling him this story, which I thought was particularly interesting and scary, about these 3 gold prospectors, and 2 of them killed the other one so that they could steal his share of the claim. And then he came back and haunted them and chased them until they fell down a gold mining shaft and died. And I thought this was a great story. And then my dad thought about it for about 2 seconds and said, "So if they all died, who's telling the story?" And so he kind of taught me to think rationally. He just tended not to do it so much about his religion. And that was kind of it's an Australian Irish Catholic tribal thing. That's part of the package. You kind of have to stick with the church, because otherwise you just be letting down the tribe. And again, that was something else I never quite got. So by about the my mid-teens, I suppose, I was still a believer, certainly still believing in God. But by my late teens, I pretty much worked out that it was all bullshit, and did so by actually examining the origins of Christianity. So I remember quite distinctly the day that I became interested in this stuff. I was 16, and I was sitting on the sidelines of a high school lunchtime conversation between a very annoying evangelical Baptist fundamentalist Christian and a guy who was an agnostic. And this was sort of like my first exposure as a kind of a believer to someone who was being skeptical about religion in a reasonably systematic way. Now, he really didn't know what he was talking about, but he sure as hell knew a lot better than she did. And she kept saying, Jesus said this, and Jesus did that, and Jesus was this, and he kept saying, how do you know? And she kept saying, well, it's in the Bible. And he said, yeah, but who wrote the Bible? And he was talking about the Gospels being written hundreds of years after the fact, which is not true. But as I said, I'd never actually thought about this stuff. And I remember thinking, even though I was probably closer, not close, but closer to her beliefs, I remember thinking, well, if I ever I remember thinking he got the better of her in that conversation. So I thought if I ever found myself challenged in that way, I want to know what I'm talking about. And as a young fellow who was interested in history and already very interested in ancient medieval history, I thought, well, I'll go and read the books, right? It's pretty straightforward. I'll go and do some reading. Obviously, people before me have done this. They've sat down and worked out why Christianity is true. So I'll just go and read the books by the smart people who have done that, and then I'll know why Christianity is true. And then when someone challenges me, I'll be fine. It didn't quite work out that way. What happened was I happened to go to a school that had a very good comparative religion class and an excellent comparative religion teacher who became a bit of a mentor of mine and who is still a friend to this day. And as a result, it had quite a good collection of books on New Testament scholarship for what was effectively a regional high school. So the teacher kind of helped me. He didn't tell me what to read. He sort of gave me a couple of pointers. So I read everything from C.H. Dodd to Geza Vermes and everything in between, Rudolf Boltmann and everything I could get my hands on. And within, actually thinking back, a relatively short period, I went from being more or less a believer to being an absolute skeptic when it came to the origins of Christianity, and pretty much accepted that Jesus was an apocalyptic Jewish preacher and not any of the things that Christianity claimed. Once I got to university, I got access to a much greater range of material and was able to sort of expand my knowledge quite a bit. I also started doing a degree in an arts degree, and so I studied philosophy, history, particularly medieval history was my specialisation, and English literature. And the philosophy course was run by a guy called Bob Josky, who was quite a prominent philosopher at the time, and wrote some very good stuff on atheism. He ran a unit within that course called The Existence of God, which basically just went through the arguments and went through the counter arguments and so on. So by the time I'd finished that course, in fact, probably before, I was pretty much an atheist and have been an atheist ever since. So contrary to what some people will tell you, no, I'm not a Catholic apologist. And our friend Richard Carrier, as recently as last weekend, was declaring that that's what I am. I'm not a crypto-Christian. I'm not a Christian at all, and I'm not a theist. I don't believe in God, and have been a paid up member of the Australian Atheist Foundation for about the last sort of 10 years at least, I think. Former state president of the Australian Skeptics. I'm very much an atheist. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's safe to assume that you are not a Catholic apologist.
But the funny thing is, when you're doing the kind of thing that I do as my hobby, and I need to stress, I'm not a scholar in any of the topics that I write about. I'm an interested amateur. I'll come back to that point. But in any of those topics, when you're trying to counter myths, there's a tendency for you to have to kind of go a bit the other way. And so sometimes people will read me saying things like, well, the Catholic Church wasn't a theocracy, because it wasn't. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't a theocracy. It didn't completely dominate politics and culture. It didn't rule Europe. That's bullshit. That's not true. And people hear that and they think I'm saying that meant that the Catholic Church wasn't hugely influential, didn't have a voice in the political systems, a very loud voice, and wasn't and didn't influence events. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you can't go from that to saying that it's a theocracy, because words have meanings. The same with when I say, well, the Catholic Church, didn't do X. They didn't, for example, execute millions of witches or 9 million witches. people hear that and think that I'm saying the Catholic Church didn't execute any witches. That's not true. They executed thousands of witches, just nowhere near as many as some people claim. And actually, it was more of a Protestant, on the whole, it was more of a Protestant thing, the whole witch craze. So when you're sort of correcting mistakes and debunking myths, there's a danger for people to sort of see or to hear you as sort of going the other way. And that's why people get confused and they think that I'm an apologist. If you say stuff that the Catholic Church did do, like covering up the rape of a whole lot of children, for example, quite recently, or trying to convert the Baltic regions by force, and there really was a theocracy up in Latvia and Lithuania in the late Middle Ages. You won't hear a peep out of me because that did happen. You know, that the forced conversions of Indians in Native Americans in the Americas did happen. So I don't write about that stuff because that's not a myth. That's true. And some people sort of say, well, why don't you write about all the bad stuff that the Christians have done? And the answer is because there are plenty of other people doing that. Right? Plenty of other people. So you can get online any time, and you can read all sorts of people who are going through that stuff. You know, why don't you write about the stuff that Christians get wrong about history? Because there are plenty of other people doing that. The reason I focus on new atheist bad history, or what I refer to as new atheist bad history, is that no one else is really calling it out other than Christians, and of course everyone pays no attention to them because they're Christians. So this is why I think people sort of mistake me for being something like an apologist. And it's simply because I'm holding us as rationalists to account and saying, well, if you're going to say that we check our facts, that we look at things objectively, that we do our research and we pay attention to mainstream scholarship, not fringe nonsense, then we need to actually fucking do that. And unfortunately, way too many of us, you know, the non-believers, don't, and they simply accept any old crap that comes along so long as it's anti-religious. And then some of them will fight tooth and nail if you try to, and I know this from experience, if you try to correct them, they get most irrational and highly emotional. So whenever I hear rationalists saying, oh, we're very, very objective and very rational and we look at things, you know, unemotionally, that's just, in many cases, that's just total crap.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have to say, I can attest to this because I used to be a fundamentalist Baptist young earth creationist. So coming out of it, and this is only within a year. This is only a year ago. Okay. I came out of it, and it's like, you feel a draw. You do feel a draw to go into the extreme other way, because it's like everything you believed, everything you thought you knew is not true. I mean, the Noah's flood story, 6 days of creation, the earth being between 6,000 and 10,000 years old. Everybody knows there's a God. Yeah. The true God. Yeah. And I have to say, Jesus mythicism was looking appealing to me. I was not fully immersed in it, but I was researching this, looking into it, listening to podcasts, listening to like people like David Fitzgerald and Richard Carrier, and I even downloaded his Crestus app to my iPhone. Yeah, so I couldn't afford Carrier, so I went to David Fitzgerald and got some. Yes. Yes.
So the bargain basement being Carrier. David
yes. Okay. Yeah, I was cheap. I couldn't afford $80 for one book, so I bought the $7 to $10 book on Kindle.
Fair enough.
So I'm actually having to rewire my brain to the point so I'm not so fundamentalist in my outlook and approach. That's the key thing. In fact, just recently, I've been in conversations with Steve McRae on learning philosophy and how important it is, instead of just saying, oh, well, philosophy, it's just a bunch of navel gazing. You don't get anywhere with it. Well, now, hold on a minute. Wait a minute. So there's a rational argument to be made. So anyway, back on topic. So I'm coming away from this Jesus mythicism and realizing that the people writing this stuff do not know everything they claim to know, and in some cases it looks like blatant misrepresentation of facts that we can see. It's like, wait a minute, how did you get to this conclusion using this? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I can also attest. Oh, to so you guys, you will have to bear with us. The internet and for some reason the connection host has been a little trippy with the technology. That's why we were delayed getting started up here. So Tim will be right back. But yeah, I can also say, as an ex-carrierite, what Tim describes is very accurate. It's like because I came out of Christianity, and then I was instantly like, everything in Christianity is bad, everything in Christianity is evil, and I'm going to fight everything. I'm going to fight it all with everything I got. So mythicism became very appealing to me, especially carrier. And so there's people like Tim Chafee from Answers in Genesis who can attest to just how crappy it was trying to deal with me. But
and basically the challenge is to challenge what you think you know, challenge what you believe to be true, but more importantly, why do you believe what you believe? And yeah, I mean, it's a challenge to me, and that's why I love getting involved in discussions like this, because there's like Tim said, there's no reason to have bad arguments to bolster your beliefs or understanding of history, and that's why this is important. And I'll just go ahead and read some of because I'm following the chat. So Ahmed, welcome back. Sadie, Jonah Epstein, thank you so much for your patience. Lawrence from Milwaukee Atheist, hey, how you guys doing? I attempted to do the stream hours ago, and I was so far off on the time differences between Australia and us, so I apologize. So thank you guys for being here, and hope you enjoy it. Hope you guys have an open mind. And I have to say, the arguments that we sometimes see in the Jesus mythicist camp almost smacks of young Earth creationism in their approach to the data field. And I'm a follower of James Downard, who is a science communicator, and his challenge every time, he always challenges us: go to the primary sources. Don't rely on second, third, fourth, and fifth hand information. Go to the source and try to get as close to the primary source as you can.
Yep, makes sense.
Yay, Tim's back, everybody. We let him know that this might happen again throughout.
It could, so apologies in advance. Yeah.
Don't worry. If it happens, we'll just continue. We know you're coming right back.
Okay.
So basically, my challenge was to myself is, don't be a young Earth creationist in your mind. Go to the primary source data. There's a total treasure trove. There are so many good arguments to be had. Why go for the lowest common denominator, the lowest low? Go ahead, Tim.
Brian, I think part of it is, I think there's a couple of things going on. I don't think there's any coincidence that a hell of a lot of people who are inclined towards mythicism quite often come from backgrounds like yours, because I think there's a few things going on. One of the things that's happening, I think, is psychological, and it's a bit like what you just described. If you've just discovered that everything you thought was true turns out to be crap, then there's almost a natural tendency to go from one extreme idea to the other extreme. Well, if this is completely wrong, this must be completely right. And I can sort of understand why people might go through that. And certainly when I started reading about this stuff, I kind of went through the same thing. I think the difference is that you came from a fairly much more extreme and much more, if you don't mind me saying, much more hardcore set of beliefs than I did. So for me, it was less of a transition. But I remember coming across the concept of Jesus mythicism back then and looking at it with a very open mind and looking at it very carefully, and reasonably quickly spotted the problems with it and rejected it, but came back to it several times and maybe, thought maybe, well, possibly. The difference being, I think back then, and I'm talking in the mid-'80s, because, I'm quite old, back then there wasn't a hell of a lot of mythicist stuff around. I'm glad you laughed at that. That's good. So really the mythicist stuff that I was looking at was stuff from like the late 19th, early 20th century, people like Brynner Vow and so on, which actually isn't that different from the arguments that are used today. In fact, that mythicism hasn't actually changed that much. What has changed is that the loudspeaker through which it gets broadcast. And I remember first coming across it again for the first time in the late 90s. And first I came across it on sort of kooky conspiracy theory, Usenet discussion groups. And then I started coming across it on some other slightly more mainstream ones. And then I started finding it on atheist groups. And it was sort of interesting watching that transition. But I suppose back to the psychology. So there's that. It's like, if this is completely wrong, then this other extreme must be more correct. I think the other thing is that I find that a lot of people who come out of that sort of fundamentalist belief come out of it with a great deal of anger and resentment and animus against Christianity. And so what they're looking for quite often is a kind of a righteous anger and a desire to sort of make Christianity, to demonstrate that Christianity is completely wrong. And mythicism gives them a bigger stick to hit Christianity with than, say, simply accepting that Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. Because, and I've actually had people say this to me, some of these people say, if we allow that Jesus might have existed at all, then there's almost like a slippery slope, and if the Christians are right about that, they might be right about other things as well, which I find very peculiar. But I've had probably about 5 or 6 people over the years say this to me. So they're looking for a reason for Christianity to be as wrong as possible, and mythicism gives that to them. I've had mythicists say, well, that's not my motivation at all, but I wonder how honest they're kind of being with themselves. And then there's, I think, a third thing which plays into this, and I don't know, Brian, if this is relevant to you, but I find that many people who are attracted to.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely attractive. And when we get back to Tim in just a minute, I'm actually monitoring the comments on the Facebook post that I've made of this show. Somebody by the name of Anne says, the biblical Jesus never existed. And I asked her, well, how can you be so sure? And then she says in bold caps, no evidence. And so I responded back, well, there's much evidence to show that he's most likely historical. Some of that evidence is being presented now. Come join us and see what you think. So I'm going to pose this to the listening audience. If you think there's a chance that, okay, so she's posted a blog back to me, truthbeknown.com, Pliny. I've seen very, very little evidence that a historical Jesus ever existed. Well, okay, so we're going to actually talk about that. So if anybody in the chat feels that there's absolutely no evidence, well, please, by all means, come join us. So Alias, bless his heart, he's watching while driving home. Well, he's not he's not watching, he's listening. Hey, Alias, thank you. Appreciate it. But no, I mean, if anybody in the chat feels that you believe that there's not enough evidence or no evidence that Jesus existed, we'll welcome you on the stream. You can talk to Tim yourself.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, we will be keeping an eye on that because we also have to respect Tim's time completely.
So HistoryNet says mythicism is about as attractive as an aged hooker. So my reply is this: some hookers age well, though. Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I love you, HistoryNet. But here's the problem: is that in this case, mythicism's not really an aged hooker. It's more cocaine.
Okay. Yes.
You snort it. It's really good, but it's really bad for you too.
Yeah, it feels good in the moment until you wake up the next day, and then you find out, oh shit, there was a lot of fish scale in that. So yeah, so hey, don't hate on the aged hookers now.
Yeah, it's proof that Jesus existed. The missing census. There would be no reason to include it in the Bible if JC hadn't been a real person. I'm not sure I get how that logic actually follows.
I was looking at that. I don't know.
Yeah, I am.
You could say a clue, but I don't know that would count as evidence, though. There would be no reason to include it in the Bible if Jesus Christ wouldn't have been a real person. So, Tim, you were saying something that applies to me as far as being fundamentalist in mindset. Could you go over that?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, some people, as I said, some people either because they're raised in a fundamentalist environment or because they have joined one, tend to think in either black or white. So I've actually been to Pentecostalist churches. I used to do this as a hobby because I used to find them very amusing, and heard preachers say, you have to believe everything in the Bible because either it's all true or none of it is. And this is something that gets drummed into biblical literalists. There's no in between. It's either absolutely true, so either Noah's Ark happened and Jesus did walk on water, or none of it is true. And I find that a hell of a lot of people that I talk to about mythicism who come from that background have kind of taken that thinking with them. And so they say to me, well, if this stuff isn't true, like the walking on water stuff isn't true, then why should we take the other stuff, such as Jesus existing? Why should we accept that any of it is true? Well, if they made up any of it, or if any of it is non-historical, then surely it's all non-historical. And that's a non sequitur. It doesn't actually follow. It might be that it's all non-historical, and I will never say that mythicism is out of the question. I've come across Christians who say, oh, it's a ridiculous idea. It's not a ridiculous idea. It's not the best idea, but it's not a ridiculous one. It's absolutely possible that they could have invented Jesus, or that Jesus could have developed, the idea of a historical Jesus could have developed out of earlier other ideas such as an allegorical Jesus or a celestial Jesus or a pagan amalgam Jesus. But it doesn't follow that just because some of the stuff, and everyone except fundamentalists agree, that some of the stuff in the Gospels is not historical, therefore none of it is. So I find out a lot of the attraction to mythicism is that it provides a kind of an absolutist way of looking at things that really appeal to people, to certain people. I think the other thing that it does, though, is, and this is something that I suppose I've been thinking about recently, a lot of people come out of the kind of faith that you had, Brian, and mythicism is the first rational alternative to the it all happened version, right? So you got told when it says that Jesus went from Nazareth to Capernaum, or when it says that Jesus walked on water, or when it says that Jesus said this in sitting outside the temple, that's because that actually happened. And when you realize that at least some of that stuff clearly didn't happen, particularly the walking on water and rising from the dead stuff, then you're looking for, if you're looking for a way to explain how these stories arose and how Christianity came about, if what you have been told is not true, and that he wasn't the Son of God and God in human form and the second person of the Trinity, etc. When you go looking for that stuff, it's very difficult to find an alternative story that's easy to access, particularly if you go looking on the internet. What you tend to find, though, is mythicist stuff. You can find mythicist stuff really easily. And so as a result, mythicism has packaged itself extremely well for the neophyte non-believer. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has gained a fair bit of traction in the internet age, whereas it didn't before. When I was searching for this stuff, I didn't click on a YouTube video and see Richard Carrier talking about the cosmic sperm bank in the sky and think, well, that makes perfect sense. I had to go read books, and I had to read some pretty weighty books. I mean, if you sit down with Geza Vermez's Jesus the Jew, where it's quoting stuff in Aramaic and so on, and this was pretty heavy stuff for a 16-year-old. But that's the work I had to do. And I think that gave me a pretty good foundation and a pretty good grounding. Whereas I think I'm glad, in a way, that I didn't have the capacity to just click on a YouTube link or click on a blog or go to an atheist conference and find this stuff being presented to me in a very glib way.
Yeah. I think he locked up.
Yeah, and yeah, I have to agree that mythicism is packaged very well. See, I'm in two camps. I totally agree with you, Tim, that there's a danger of just finding stuff on the internet and finding it on YouTube, and then it connects with you emotionally, and so you start to rationalize it. I mean, in my experience, I've found some pretty wild stuff on the internet. That's how I found out about Nephilim and the Genesis 6 giants thing, and the whole issue of taking the Bible to its literalist form. I mean, flat earthers will look at the Bible and they'll take it literally, and they'll have arguments for flat earth, and then you see all these videos, and then you watch enough of them, and if you're not thinking critically, or you're not of the mindset of trying to be as critical and as fair as possible, right? Even young Earth creationists is very well marketed, and I would say that in my case, I'm actually glad for YouTube, and I'm glad for YouTubers that actually put out good information, because I can listen to it for hours, whereas it's very hard for me to find time to sit and read a book. I mean, when you're working 12 hours a day, good luck trying to find time to read. Now, obviously, you're never going to have time. There's the old adage, you're never going to have time, you have to make time, and that's true. So well, that's true. There are atheists, agnostic, flat earthers. That is true. But the majority, I have to wonder about. The majority of flat earthers, some are non-religious.
Most of them are spiritual in some way. Most of them are theists.
Yeah, theistic. Maybe not biblical. Yeah, maybe not biblical.
I would argue that a lot of them are probably coming from it from a biblical standpoint, though I know there's also there are quite a few Muslim flat earthers that I've been aware of, and pagan flat earthers. But most of them are all religious in some way.
I was going to say, well, that's interesting. Muslim flat earthers?
Oh, yeah.
Since when? Wow. I mean, I guess it's true. I mean, it's possible, but man, that's almost like a that is almost like a unicorn. You just don't see very many of those. Okay, then. All right. We'll have to talk about that at some point. So, I mean, are you involved in any flat Earth communities?
Oh, I used to be, and then I decided I didn't want to waste my time. It's like, there's no point sticking around these people. I got better things to do. Because flat earthers are more delusional than half the carrierites I know.
Oh yeah, and
he's back.
All right, so
this is terrible.
I was just championing the virtues of YouTube videos in my case, because I'm at a machine shop for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. So I understand your point, and I was saying you're going to find some garbage, and if you're not critically thinking, you can fall for some serious garbage. I mean, I used to be in the Genesis 6 Nephilim giants. You ever hear that?
Sounds awesome.
Oh, trust me, it is awesome. But okay, so when you read Genesis chapter 6, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they had offspring. Yep, and the giants. Oh yeah, there have been many books. I've got 8 of them, books written on this topic. And if you're not thinking, and Christopher can verify. If you're not thinking critically, you will get caught up in a lot of misrepresentation, Zachariah Sitchin like stuff. It's just awesome. So go ahead.
It's like the Christ conspiracy of younger.
Yes.
Right. Well, again, the thing is, I remember in my first year of university, I read a classic sort of bad history conspiracy theory called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was later taken by a particularly stupid thriller writer called Dan Brown and turned into the Da Vinci Code. And then the authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was supposedly a non-fiction book, then sued him for plagiarism and lost. But I remember reading Holy Blood, Holy Grail in my first year of uni and thinking, this is awesome. Yeah, it seemed really cool, and it all made so much sense, and it was connecting all these bits of history that I kind of already knew a bit about. And then 2 years later, with the rest of a history degree under my belt and a lot better skills at detecting bullshit, I went right back and reread it. And it was like I was reading a different book. But it's easy to go...
Jesus, internet.
Yeah. So I mean, it's easy to get it's easy to get carried away and taken with a lot of the goofiness that comes with Tim. Eventually, he's going to. I want him to really get into his arguments that he has had to deal with as far as the misrepresentation of history, and there really isn't, and like we've said before, there really isn't a reason to have bad arguments. So I really want Tim O'Neill to get into his arguments that he's had to break down, and some of them are quite interesting. And you mentioned when we mention the Catholic Church, the first thing that comes to mind is, well, the Catholic Church stymied and tried to stop science that went against the church and went against doctrine. And come to find out, it really isn't the case. And as a matter of fact, some of the scientists that were persecuted by the church, there's quite a bit of a backstory to that. And Tim O'Neill's, hopefully he'll be able to get into that. But they talk about Galileo being jailed for his proposals of the solar system and gravity. And, well, it turns out that that's not exactly what happened. And Copernicus and Kepler and... There's another guy that's touted as a scientist. I always get his name wrong. Is it Moore or Bohr? He lived around the time of Galileo. Come to find out, he wasn't even a scientist. He was kind of a wacky spiritualist, had his own idea of how the universe ran, and totally didn't understand Kepler. can't remember his name. What is his name? He was actually burned at the stake. And he's used as an example.
Burning at the stake, that doesn't really, you know, narrow down things that much.
No, that's true. Come to find out, when it happened, Galileo and Kepler were both like, yay, thankfully that guy is gone. And I'm like, holy shit. But that, I mean, I don't agree with that method of getting rid of people that you deem as heretics, but goodness gracious.
You know, if you're going to get rid of heretics, get rid of them in style.
Yeah.
You know, I for one, when I want to get rid of heretics, I like piano wire.
Oh,
gets really nifty sometimes.
And you better be wearing a pinstripe suit when you do
it. To the FBI watching this, no, I don't actually get rid of heretics with piano wire.
We love heretics. Okay, so yeah, we love heretics. Trust me.
So Tim, the time for Tim to join back in right there.
No, yes, please save us from ourselves. Could you go into some of the arguments that you've had to literally dissect and disassemble because they were just so bad? We were just talking about the Catholic Church's suppression of science. And I think you know where we're going. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So the fairy tale version is that that the Greeks and Romans were wonderfully rational and scientific, and on the verge of a scientific revolution because they invented steam engines and they had the Antikythera mechanism, which is basically a kind of a computer, and so they were on the brink of breaking out into a full industrial and scientific revolution until Christianity came along and destroyed all that. And what happened was Christianity burned burned down the Great Library of Alexandria, burned and destroyed the books and banned all the books of the great wise and rational Greeks and Romans, plunged the world into a 1,000-year dark age, the Middle Ages, where they dominated all learning. And it was only thanks to the wonderful Renaissance and the glorious dawning of the Enlightenment that we got the scientific method. So we were set back by 1,000 years because of Christianity. That's a wonderful story, and like all fairy tales, it's got a nice, neat beginning, middle, and end, and it's got a villain, and it's got heroes, and it's got a happy ending. The only problem with that story is that it's complete shit. And it didn't happen. And some people get very upset when I point this out. And I have to say, well, actually, it's not just me saying this, because they say, well, you know, you're just a blogger. Okay, fine. I've got shelves full of books by actual historians of science who say it's shit and actually get quite weary of having to explain to people that this isn't true. So it's a fairy tale that a lot of rationalists have accepted, and it's because it was promulgated in the 18th and 19th century by some people who had legitimate beefs with the Christian Church, and so they kind of cobbled this story together out of bits and pieces of facts, and then added some stuff that isn't true, and came up with this wonderful story that lots of people, lots of atheists in particular, believe. It didn't happen. So what actually happened was this. First of all, the Greeks and Romans certainly did do a lot of what we could call proto-scientific work in a field that they referred to as natural philosophy. And they came up with some brilliant ideas and worked out some stuff that was absolutely true and were remarkable. They also got a whole lot of stuff wrong. And to say that they were doing science, well, they weren't. They were using a form of kind of inductive reasoning and applying it to the natural world and getting some stuff right and getting quite a bit wrong. But they were kind of doing it for different reasons, though, to the way scientists do it today. It was more part of a wider philosophy and a scheme for sort of understanding how to live. So aspects of what they did were, to us, look very scientific, but when you look at them more carefully, it's actually pretty mystical stuff. So the Pythagoreans, for example, believed in all sorts of stuff that most scientists would just sort of say, well, that's ridiculous. And the Platonic school, the Neoplatonics in particular, went down a path of in some schools of Neoplatonic thought, went down a path of what can only be described as mystical, magical thinking, where they were actually doing rituals which were supposed to bring them into greater in tune with make them more in tune with the universe. So it's easy to mistake the Greek and Roman stuff for modern science, and to then to think that they were much more scientific than they were. That's not to disparage the stuff that they did, which laid the later foundations for science. What happened then, though, was when Christianity came along, there was actually a debate within Christianity from about the 2nd century to about the 5th century, whereby Christians were saying, on one side, were saying, well, we don't need any of that pagan knowledge because that's all pagan stuff. We can reject all that because Jesus came along and gave us the revelation of God. And so we've got the Bible. And so we have these sacred scriptures. So we have the word of God. We don't need any of that pagan.
Yeah, and so we do know that, and the Greeks and Romans, not really, not as scientific as we would like to think. I know some people would, they like to say that if the church hadn't held back science, we'd be living on Mars and had colonies on the moon. We would be like Star Trek now. And when Tim comes back, he's going to talk to us about how untrue that really is. And I really want to bring up Galileo and also Kepler, and I want to say Copernicus, and also that unnamed scientist I can't think of right at this moment. I know Tim O'Neill knows exactly who I would be talking about, and we'll be talking about that. So if anybody in the chat has any comments or I'm sorry, questions, if you have any questions, we'll try to get to them. Yeah, and Michael Apple says all of that is a naive sort of Saganism, not saying bad things about Sagan's cosmos, which was wonderful, but that did help push his notion into popularity. I have to agree partly without having delved deep into Sagan, but some of the things that Sagan talked about, yeah, I have to agree. There were some things that even Sagan glommed onto and promoted that were not quite historically true as far as how science was done. And yeah, I have to admit, yeah, there have been some presentations. As a matter of fact, I think Tim O'Neill did point out a few things on his blog. I didn't have enough time to read through his entire blog, but he does mention Sagan and how. No, I don't think it was Newton history. This was during the time of Galileo. So there was a scientist who really doesn't qualify as a scientist, but he was burned at the stake for his really outlandish ideas and his misrepresentation of Kepler. And I think they executed him. Tycho Brahe? No, I don't think so. Somebody was Bruno. Thank you. Yes, Bruno. Bruno was 1599. Okay, thank you. See, this is why we love the live chat so much, because some of you guys are, well, many of you are much more knowledgeable than I. I'm actually picking up some of this stuff at a later date. As you know, I went to a fundamentalist Christian school, so. How do I say this? My education was severely lacking as far as historical references, historical happenings. Yeah, it was pretty much presented with a fundamentalist point of view. So, and that just goes to show you how we have to be, we have to be careful of thinking we know what we know. And we have to make sure that it comports with reality as much as possible, as far as, what can be shown to be true, and not delve into like we've talked about, mysticism is something that, things that just have no, yeah. So am I, history. So am I. And I am still reading that book you told me to get. That we'll have to talk about that sometime.
Which book?
In Search of the Warrior God.
Oh,
it's a summary of that work because it's called Cross Visioned.
Yeah, it's Greg Boyd, right?
Greg Boyd, yes. So I still have it on my bed table. I'm still going through it. I'm not very far into it because there's a lot of, like I said, it is hard for me to pick up a book and just sit and read until it's done. So yeah, no, Ahmed, everybody is weird in some way or another. That is true. I mean, you're looking at me. Hello.
He's a Chicago or Illinois guy.
I'm a Chicago gangster wearing a cowboy. What in the hell? I bought this in Texas, believe it or not.
You went to Texas?
I did go to Texas. My brother lives out there and he got married.
Okay.
Also, while I was going to church in my teen years, we went to Texas every year. There was a church in Longview, Longview Baptist Temple, and we went there. Yes, Crucifixion of the Warrior God. Yes. And I couldn't find his book, but I did find one of his book that summarizes his book, Crucifixion of the Warrior God. That's a 2-volume set. And it was nowhere in the library system, but he has a couple of other books, and one of them was Cross Visioned, which is a summary of his 2-volume book. So anyway, we would go to Longview Baptist Temple every year for a soul winning clinic and also for youth convention. And so I'm familiar with the Longview area, and hopefully I'll be going to Austin.
Here we go. Here in the chat, Blood Cell 9. Regardless of what you or Tim O'Neill may say or think, when Christianity took over the reins of power, humanity still went through the dark ages. ... Why? Question mark. Caps.
Well, let's be charitable. Okay, so the Dark Ages happened with the collapse of the Roman Empire. We have to realize this. The church had nothing.
Historians don't even use the term Dark Ages anymore. Correct.
Okay, there was a collapse. There was a collapse of the Roman Empire, and that caused almost a vacuum of knowledge, where books weren't printed.
Well,
education.
It's not really that. Tim's going to get into it.
Go ahead.
We'll let Tim get into this, but it's not really that. It was more just the power vacuum that was left. And it was the power vacuum that was left specifically in the East, because it was the Eastern Empire that collapsed. But we'll let Tim handle that, because we don't want to spoil it.
Yes, no, I don't want to spoil it. Okay, so Tim, real carefully, could you talk about the science of Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, and Bruno? We are told that the Catholic Church, they suppressed science, and they did everything they could to suppress science, and they jailed Galileo. They persecuted Bruno. So real quickly, Tim, if you could, if we could go over Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, and Bruno, and if you could address the Catholic Church's dealings with these people, because I think many people are under the impression that the Catholic Church persecuted scientists because they dared to go against the teachings of the church. And a case could be made that the church, and I'm starting to see more evidence of this, that the church actually advanced science and was actually a patron of different scientists. So, Tim, can you hear me? All right.
Hey, Tim, can you hear us?
Yeah, give us a thumbs up as soon as you can hear us. So, yeah, and then you had the barbarians. There was a huge. You had Attila the Hun, the barbarian. Yeah, Tim, can you hear?
It was the Goth invasion. But,
yeah,
Tim. He was wondering. Can you hear us? Okay.
Okay, so we're having audio issues for just a minute. Okay.
Here, let me send a chat message. Brian, entertain the crowd.
That's okay. So, so really, Blood Cell 9, we have to realize that the Dark Ages that the time period that we call the Dark Ages was basically the power vacuum that took place, once the Western Empire collapsed. So people went back to Eastern. I'm sorry, Eastern.
Wait, you're right. Western. I flipped them. Yep.
Don't confuse me. I'm confused already. So, okay, when you have a collapse of an empire, people go back to an agrarian society, mostly agrarian, to where they're scratching in the dirt for a living. And so oftentimes what happens is education is put on the back burner because, look, we need to go out into the fields. We need to get the crops in. We need to plant. We need to plow. We can't send you to school. And who's going to teach you? I mean, most of the rulers that ruled over territories, they couldn't even read or write their own name. Many times they were ignorant themselves. So the high echelons of power were very ignorant themselves. So what do you think? What chance did the peasants have? Okay, so Michael Apple says the 5th and 6th century AD. In the West, the Carolingian Renaissance changed the balance in the 8th century. Then another series of barbarian.
Real quick, can you hear us, Tim?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh,
yes.
Right. Yes. Yay. Okay. So basically, if Tim, could you talk about the supposed suppression of science by the church? We were talking about Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, and Bruno. All those, I believe, are referenced in your blog. So could you just take us through the church's interaction with science and scientists?
No problem. Okay. Big topic. Venue change, in my bedroom, guys. So I suppose the point is that maybe if I can just get back to what I was saying before we were rudely interrupted, and then I'll come back to your question. Remember, I was saying that that there was a debate within Christianity on what to do about this pagan learning, and there were some people, the conservatives, who were saying we should reject it. And so there's a very well-known quote that you get in most of the books that try to argue that Christianity did suppress science, by a guy called Tertullian. And Tertullian was arguing against some uses, not all, but some uses of Greek philosophy. And he made the comment, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? So in other words, what does Christianity, what has philosophy got to do with Christianity? We don't need Jerusalem. We need Athens, we have Jerusalem. The point is that was one side of a fairly complicated debate. And there was another side. The other side were people like Clement of Alexandria, who said that all knowledge ultimately comes from God, and that truth is like a river that flows towards the ocean. The ocean is God's truth, and the river is man's apprehension of truth, and that this river is fed by many different streams. And so he argued that just as the Jews had a particular gift from God for divine revelation, which is why the Old Testament was included in the Christian Bible, so the Greeks had a divine gift for rational analysis of the physical world. And he said that we shouldn't reject the gifts of God. The river of truth is fed by many different streams. This is one or a number of streams that feed into the river of truth. So what effectively he was arguing, it was taken up by many others, John of Damascus, and eventually, most influentially, by Augustine of Hippo. What they were saying was, we shouldn't reject this stuff. It's a gift from God. We should keep it and use it. So they used what they call the gold of the Egyptians argument. They said that just as the Israelites had carried off the gold of Egypt in the book of Exodus and put that to their own use and turn that into holy vessels that they use for the worship of God. So we should carry off the gold of the Egyptians, the treasures of Greek learning, and put it to holy use. Now that kind of sounds like they weren't really thinking in very scientific terms, and they weren't. They were thinking very much in theological terms. But what they were saying was ultimately that this stuff should be preserved, and so it was. So what happened in the so-called Dark Ages wasn't that they rejected this knowledge and so it was lost. That's not true. They had already started to enshrine it in their own curricula, and their curricula of study, and the way in which you basically became a learned person. What happened was that the Western Roman Empire collapsed, and that tends to fuck up your whole day. I mean, when civilization collapses, and the Western Roman Empire didn't just collapse a little bit, it collapsed completely, and in some places things went pretty Mad Max. I mean, the gangs took over the highway, and people were basically, living in thatched huts in the ruins of what had been once great cities. Not everywhere, but certainly in the northern and western fringes. The other thing is that Western Europe had always been the economic poor relation of the Roman Empire. So once the Western Empire collapsed, things did go seriously backward economically and technically, but certainly things had been going backward for a long time in terms of learning. So whereas once in the first or even into the second century AD, if you were a learned and literate aristocrat, most learned people were of the upper class, you tended to be literate in Greek. What happened in the 3rd century was the Roman Empire almost fell apart and only managed to struggle back in the 4th century. And one of the things that never really recovered in the West was a lot of education, particularly education in Greek. So Greek literacy was already declining. The problem of that poses for anyone who wanted to study natural philosophy was that most of the books were written in Greek. So by the 6th century, you had a couple of scholars, Boethius and Cassiodorus, both Christians, who recognized that this was a major problem. And what they started to do was translate the key works of ancient Greek learning into Latin so that more people could read them. And the first works they chose were basically works of logic, because logic was sort of the fundamental foundation of that entire tradition. And so it was lucky that they translated some key works of logic by Porphyry and by Aristotle, particularly Aristotle, which became known in the Middle Ages as the logic of Vetus, or the old logic. And that was preserved before those guys, unfortunately, that whole program fell apart. There was the Gothic Wars, and then things went even more Mad Max. So what happened then was that you had this foundation of ancient knowledge, not much, but just enough, and it was based on logic. Right? So when you went to a school in, let's say, during the Carolingian Renaissance, which was just referred to, when you went to a school, you studied the 7 liberal arts. These were the foundational units of study that you had to master if you wanted to be a learned person in the early medieval period. These were divided into the trivium, 3 foundational units of study, and then the quadrivium, the more advanced study. The trivium consisted of grammar, so you had to learn how to read and write in Latin. Rhetoric, you had to learn how to construct an argument in an elegant and eloquent and convincing way. And the final one was logic, or dialectic. These were the foundational units of study. So what that meant was that by the time medieval Europe began to climb out of that period of chaos from about the 5th century through to about the 10th century, economic expansion began to happen. You had some remarkable technical developments, and you actually launched into a medieval boom period. What happened was, when they decided, hey, we want to go back and relearn that stuff that we know has been forgotten, we know has been lost. And they went to the Arabic world, so they went to Sicily and Spain, and then they went to the Greek-speaking world to rediscover and revive that knowledge. What they went looking for was not poetry, not pretty plays, not even history. What they went looking for was logic, natural philosophy, mathematics. That was the stuff they were interested in. The Renaissance that we hear so much about, which is supposedly the great revival of ancient learning, those guys weren't actually very interested in that stuff because they already had it. They had it because there had been this great revival of that stuff in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, what's called the 12th century Renaissance, or the 12th century revival. So did they suppress ancient learning? No, they didn't. They lost a lot of it, but that was because that's what happens when your civilization falls apart. So with the so-called sort of suppression of science, for 30 years now, I've been saying to people, if they suppress science in the Middle Ages, give me one example of anyone who was persecuted, executed, spoken to in a harsh manner for anything to do with the rational analysis of the natural world. And they never can. They never can, because it didn't fucking happen. And they get very confused because everyone's been told that's what happened, but it didn't happen. The reason it didn't happen was that the church in the Middle Ages, both the Orthodox Church in the East, but certainly the Catholic Church in the West, came up with a way of accommodating that ancient Greek learning. They came up with it before the Middle Ages. So they'd already worked out the whole gold of the Egyptians idea. And they sort of said, well, basically there are two books that we can look at to study the way in which the world works. There's the Book of God, and that's obviously the Bible, but also the works of the various church fathers and the theologians and commentators who came afterwards. But then there's the Book of Nature. And the Book of Nature is the stuff that we can access via reason, because nature, the natural world, is the rational product of a rational God. So we can use reason to analyze that world. And what they said was, if the Book of God seems to be contradicted by the Book of Nature, then we're reading one of the books wrong. Right? So what they said was, if we look at the natural world and it seems to contradict what the Bible says, either we're misinterpreting the natural world or we're misinterpreting the Bible. They weren't biblical literalists. Right? They believed that there were actual 4 levels of exegesis, and you could read the Bible in 4 different ways, or combinations of 4 different ways. So they were quite happy, if given good reason by natural, rational analysis of the natural world, they were quite happy to reinterpret the Bible, which they did, for example, when they had to reconcile the fact that the Book of Nature said that the earth is round, whereas some passages in the Bible seem to say that the earth is flat. So what they didn't reject the science, they reinterpreted the Bible. And they said, oh, those bits are allegorical. So they were quite happy to do that. So this gave medieval, we won't call them scientists, but then they were no more or less scientists than the ancient Greeks and Romans were, but medieval natural philosophers who inherited that natural philosophy from ancient Greece and Rome. It gave them wide scope to analyze the world and come up with all kinds of stuff. They worked out how rainbows work. They did a lot of work on optics. They invented these things, for example. It gave them a great deal of scope to be able to analyze the natural world without it conflicting with their religion at all. So I often get people saying, oh yeah, they allowed people to do that stuff, but only if it didn't conflict with their faith. It didn't conflict with their faith. That's, if the Book of Nature says this is how things are, they go, okay, that's fine. It wasn't until you got to the 16th century when really you started to get any kind of major conflict between the Book of Nature and the Book of God, because that was mainly due to the politics of the post-Reformation period, where in a weird way the Catholic Church was actually becoming much less free-thinking in the way in which you interpret the Bible, because they were under threat from Protestantism. That's when you get the Galileo case. Whenever you talk about this stuff and people say, oh, they impress scientists, I say, who? Yeah, the one name always comes up. This is Galileo. So to get back to your point, Copernicus, Bruno, and Galileo are the examples that usually get used. Of all of those are post-medieval, right? So there are plenty of people in the Middle Ages who are proposing stuff that could potentially have been threatening to the church. Nicholas Oresme talked about the earth rotating. No one burned him at the stake. Nicholas of Cusa came up with the idea of a multiplicity of worlds, some of which were inhabited. No one cared. He was a cardinal. He was a papal nuncio. He was pretty much second in command to the Pope. William of Vorelon not only took that idea and ran with it, but also talked about, well, okay, if there are aliens, he didn't call them aliens, but if there are people who live on other worlds, were they redeemed by Christ's crucifixion and resurrection, or was there an alien Christ? So did every world get their own Jesus? This is in the 15th century, right? A guy in the 12th century, William of Conches, who was looking at the interpretation of the Bible and said, well, when it says that God created Adam out of dust, we don't take that literally. He said what it probably means is that there was an action of heat on mud, and things became, due to that action, things changed, things became more complex, life arose from that, and then life developed and eventually developed into us. This is in the 12th century. This guy came up with what is effectively, I mean, it wasn't a scientific idea, it was a bit of speculation, but what was effectively the fundamental principle behind evolution. So what happened was when you get to Copernicus's time, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the mathematics that lay behind the geocentric model that everyone accepted, with the Earth at the centre and celestial spheres with the various planets revolving around the Earth, and then the sphere of fixed stars. This was something that was kind of a synthesis of Ptolemy's work in what's called the Almagest, and Aristotle's ideas, particularly in his book on the heavens. So they kind of mashed those two together. Ptolemy's system is pretty much a mathematical fiddle. It's kind of a kludge. It doesn't really work very well, and it's very inelegant. But mathematicians and astronomers, that were the same thing in this period, in Copernicus's time, were becoming less and less satisfied with the way in which the Ptolemaic model worked, and were looking at ways in which they could adjust it. And that's the context for Copernicus. Copernicus said, well, here's one way we can adjust it. We take the Earth away from the centre, we put the sun at the centre, and we come up with this different system. Now, he was right about the sun being at the centre. He was wrong about everything else. And the rest of Copernicus' system is also a mathematical fiddle. It's got all these equants and various other bits and pieces that epicycles, so not equants. But it's just fucking nonsense. But it got people thinking along those lines. They also started observing things such as comets, because they were starting to do more observations of the heavens. And it got people thinking along those lines. The thing to remember, though, is when Galileo came along in the early 17th century, about 100 years, by the way, after Copernicus had first promulgated his theory, virtually no one accepted, no scientists accepted Copernicus' model. There were about 10 in the whole of Europe. And this wasn't for religious reasons, this was for scientific reasons. There were major scientific problems with Copernicus, mainly because Copernicus, as I said, was substantially wrong. So there were better ways of interpreting the data. Note, by the way, that Copernicus was never oppressed by the Catholic Church. No one cared. One of his pupils gave a lecture for the Pope in the Vatican Gardens on his theory, and the Pope thought it was wonderful. No, they didn't give a fuck. So why did they get angry with Galileo? That was largely due to the fact that Galileo, who was a mere mathematicus and therefore kind of at the bottom rung of the academic hierarchy, started dabbling in the material of the highest rung, the theologians. He started interpreting the Bible, and that's when they got angry with him. And it was, again, largely to do with the religious politics of the post-Reformation period. So it wasn't that they suddenly decided, well, we hate science. It wasn't that they even suddenly decided, well, we're going to get very angry about heliocentrism. It was actually that this guy, who they couldn't care about before, I mean, they knew he was a heliocentrist. They looked at his book on sunspots and said, yeah, okay, that's fine, you can publish that. Even though it had a whole section in it saying, I'm a Copernican. They didn't care, but they did care about a guy who wasn't a theologian intruding on the theologian's turf. That's how that whole thing got started. So you've got to understand the context, or you've got to understand the history. And unfortunately, most people just have this cartoon version, this fairy tale version in their mind. And most of what people think they know about that stuff is complete crap.
I was going to say, could you go into more detail of Galileo and how he got into trouble, and then we can tie in Bruno, because they always, yes, yeah. They always bring up the persecution of scientists, and from what I remember from your other previous talks, you've got a lot to say on Bruno. But could we focus on Galileo for just a minute and how he got himself into trouble?
Sure. So Galileo was, as I said, was a mathematicus. He was a court astrologer to the Duke of Tuscany. That was his official job. And that sounds weird to us, but astrology back then was considered scientific. So that was his job, and so he became very interested in a lot of the new speculation around astronomy, and he became convinced that Copernicus was right. He was one of the very few, as I said, about 10 to 12 people in the early 17th century who were convinced that he was right. Galileo is an interesting guy. He was a bit of a troll. He liked annoying people. He was very smart, but he was also very good at pissing people off. And he was also a bit of a contrarian. He kind of liked going against the grain, which made him a good scientist, obviously. But he also got things wrong, and when he got things wrong, he stuck stubbornly to his errors, which makes him a bad scientist. I know a couple of historians of science who just hate Galileo. They just think he's completely overrated. I wouldn't go quite that far, but he certainly has been elevated to the great saint of early science, and that's probably got more to do with culture wars and religious politics than his actual scientific status. He was certainly convinced by the late 16th century that Copernicus was right. He wasn't just convinced that Copernicus had come up with a good mathematical model that was useful. He was convinced that the stuff that was in Copernicus's model was actually going on in the sky. And that was completely wrong. As I said, he was right about the heliocentric bit, he was wrong about everything else. But Galileo stuck doggedly to his guns on that right to the day he died, and was absolutely convinced that he'd found proof that Copernicus was right. Some of the arguments that he used turned out to be correct. Others were total crap and were recognised as total crap at the time, and people told him and showed him that they were total crap, and he wouldn't. He was a stubborn bastard, very Italian. He wouldn't accept that he was wrong. So how did he get into trouble? Well, I think I just touched on that. Up until 1616, he was not only not bothered by the church actually kind of liked him, because he wasn't the first to use telescopes, that's another myth, but he had actually made a good telescope and used it to observe the phases of Venus and to observe the moon and to come across and look at sunspots and do all sorts of stuff that had never been done before. The Catholic Church, far from oppressing him over all this, even though his observations of Venus had actually pretty much put the nail in the coffin of the Copernican system, didn't put the nail in the coffin of the Tychonian system, which was becoming the favoured model in that period. But he even though he'd done that, they were so happy with him that they brought him to Rome. They gave him an honorary degree from the Collegium Romanum. They gave him audiences with various cardinals, including the one that was eventually become Pope Urban, the guy who condemned him, and with the then Pope Paul. And they put on feasts in his honour. They loved the guy. They thought he was fantastic. So much for hating science, right? The only problem was when he started to dabble in theology. So when he started to interpret the Bible in a way that was compatible with Copernicanism, that caused problems. First of all, he had a lot of enemies because he was very good at pissing people off. His enemies were mainly other scientists, and they jumped on that and used that as an excuse for basically getting the Inquisition to start looking at him. But the Inquisition was already not terribly impressed with the way in which he was dabbling in biblical interpretation. The reason that was a big issue was that after the Reformation, so after Luther, the church really went through what they call the Counter-Reformation. So the Catholic Church went back to its books and really recalibrated how they were going to operate. So they had the Council of Trent, several sessions of that over the course of the 16th century. The second session of the Council of Trent basically ruled that unless you were a qualified theologian, you could not publicly interpret the Bible. which is thought control, but this is church. And so effectively what Galileo had done was broken that rule. And so when you look at the correspondence between the various, we've got these letters between the various actors in the lead up to the first inquiry by Cardinal Bellamy in 1616, the first inquiry into Galileo's stuff. What they're doing is they're asking people, have you ever heard Sir Galilei? Have you ever heard him saying anything about the interpretation of the Bible? And various people were writing back saying, yeah, I have. I heard him say this. He also did had a kind of a dispute in front of the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Grand Duchess Christina, where he was defending Copernicanism by reference to the Bible. He then wrote a letter which was published widely, an open letter to her explaining it in more detail. And this was in circulation. This is all in 1615. So that's why he came to the attention of the Inquisition. And the politics of it was very much the politics of the Counter-Reformation. He then agreed that he wasn't going to teach Copernicanism as scientific fact and simply as a theory. And everyone was happy. Right? No one really cared too much. What then happened was that he was invited by the new Pope to write a book on the dialogue concerning the two systems, which compared Copernicanism with the Ptolemaic system. It kind of left out the third system, which was the Tychonian system, which actually didn't have any of the problem, or most of the problems of the Ptolemaic system. But he was asked to write by the Pope, was asked to write a book comparing those two systems. So again, anti-science, they're asking him to write a book about it. What he did was he wrote the book, but he weighted the arguments very, very heavily on the side of Copernicanism. And he also took some arguments that had been used by the Pope himself and put it in the mouth of the character in the dialogue that was espousing the Ptolemaic system. And he called that character Simplicissimus, which can be translated as the fool or the idiot. Right. So remember what I said about he was very good at pissing people off. He pretty much overplayed his hand rhetorically. He thought his arguments were much stronger than they actually were. One of his arguments, an argument based on the movements of the tides, was dead wrong. And he thought he was going to he was a bit arrogant. He thought he was going to carry the field with this book. All he did was piss everyone off, including the Pope. And the Pope basically just went, fuck this guy. The Inquisition was back on the case. And that was when he had to recant. So again, if you understand the context, I mean, one of the reasons the Pope couldn't just sort of sit back and let that happen was he was under political pressure from people who were saying that he was too lenient when it came to controversial and potentially heretical ideas. And so he was under pressure from factions within the church. And this was in a period of the 30 Years' War where the whole of Europe was tearing itself apart over this question of the nature of the Bible and who could interpret it. Put in that context, it not only makes sense, but this whole idea that the church was anti-science and so they oppressed Galileo falls apart. People often hear me say this stuff and say, oh, well, you're excusing what the church did. Well, no, I'm not. I'm just saying what the church did. Do I think it's good that they did that? Well, by the standards of the 21st century rationalists, fuck no. I don't think it's good. Did it make sense in the context of the 16th century where they had very different ideas about intellectual freedom and so on, ideas that we don't hold? Yeah, it did make sense. But the idea of a historian, the objective of a historian is not to pass judgment on the distant past. The more recent past you can possibly do it, but not to pass judgment, but to explain what happened, work out what happened, and then explain why. So this story, once you look at what happened and understand why, becomes very different. And the whole idea that the church hated science, wouldn't look through his telescope, that's a myth. They tortured him, that's a myth. They imprisoned him, that's a myth. Put him under house arrest, sure. But they didn't. He wasn't hanging with chains in a dungeon, as Carl Sagan seemed to think. He wasn't even shown the instruments of torture. So he wasn't even going to be tortured. He was under no danger of being executed either. He was only ever accused of being vehemently suspect of heresy, which I won't go into the boring details, but it's a lower level charge. You couldn't get burned at the stake for that. So a lot of the stuff that people think they know about Galileo is actually completely wrong. And that goes double for Bruno. So tell me what you know about Giordano, what most people say about Giordano Bruno.
Well, I can give you just the very quick, easy peasy rundown. It's he went against, and we have somebody in the chat who's saying the same thing. He went against church doctrine. His science conflicted with church dogma, and the church says, I can't have that.
And they burn him at the stake. Yeah, okay. Did he go against church doctrine? Absolutely. This guy was like a if you wanted a poster boy for heresy in the 16th century, Bruno was your man. I mean, there was barely a thing that Bruno believed that wasn't completely contrary to Christianity. He had his own kind of wacky version of Christianity in his head, but he didn't believe that Jesus was God. He didn't believe that the Virgin Mary was a virgin. He didn't believe in transubstantiation in the Mass. He didn't believe, you name it. But the problem is people often talk about Bruno as though he was a scientist, and he wasn't. Bruno was a mystic. Bruno rejected the science of his day. So it's not just that he wasn't a scientist in our sense, or that he believed unscientific things, because plenty of those guys back then, Kepler, for example, believed a whole grab bag of unscientific stuff. So did Galileo. Galileo believed in astrology. It wasn't just that. It was that even by the standards of the day, he was not considered a scientist. He wasn't part of the conversation between people like Galileo, Kepler, and Brahe and various others. He wasn't in the guild at all. He rejected it. So he wrote some praise of Copernicus. He accepted Copernicanism, but he wrote a praise of Copernicus up to a point, and then said, but unfortunately Copernicus limited himself to this mathematical geometry, and that limits your mind. You've got to release your mind and look at things intuitively. He was a mystic. So he thought that things like mathematics and experiment and observation limited you, and what you needed to do was sort of use this sort of mystical insight. And so he came up with this whole cosmology, which was I compare it to a New Ager, who kind of takes quantum mechanics and takes physics and then kind of mashes them together with a whole lot of mystical crap, and accepts the bits of science that sort of work with their mysticism, but rejects the stuff that doesn't, and then kind of mixes scientific language into their stuff to make it sound credible. So he's like Deepak Chopra. And so he quite often would say things like, well, I think this, and he'd say something that's wrong, like talking about the size of the planets, and he'd say that the geometers will prove me right. He's talking about actual scientists. Well, the geometers didn't prove him right. It was completely wrong. He also, when you read what he writes about Copernicus, he clearly hadn't actually read Copernicus's book. Now, that's understandable. Copernicus's book was big, thick, very complex, and extremely dense in its mathematics. But he also didn't understand Copernicus. So when you read his summary of Copernicus in the Ash Wednesday Supper, he gets it wrong. So this guy was not a scientist. That's the first point. He was not a scientist. He believed some things which we have later found to be true, heliocentrism, for example, and the idea of multiple worlds. But he didn't come up with any of those ideas himself. He got heliocentrism from Copernicus, obviously. He got the idea of multiple worlds from Nicholas of Cusa, who I mentioned before, who he referred to as the divine Cusanus. And he incorporated that idea of multiple worlds into his mystical, semi-magical, pseudo-Egyptian, mythological mysticism. But again, it wasn't because he'd done anything scientific. He just accepted that because he got, I don't like the idea. So first thing, his science was in conflict with the church. Fuck no, he didn't do any science. He adopted some other people's scientific ideas, which he kind of mangled and didn't quite understand. He wasn't a scientist, he was a mystic. His religious ideas certainly conflicted with that of the church, and that's what got him burnt at the stake. A lot of people say that he was burnt at the stake because he believed in heliocentrism. There is zero evidence for that. Now, the problem here is that we don't actually have the documents of his final trial, the one that actually got him burnt at the stake. They were lost in the Napoleonic Wars. What we do have is what he was questioned about. We also have the condemnation of an earlier trial from where he was on trial in Venice. And so we can kind of reconstruct what he was questioned about, and therefore what he was probably condemned for. And heliocentrism is not on that. Second thing that we can extrapolate from is he was burnt at the stake in 1599. Galileo was tried by the same Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, headed by the same guy, Robert Bellarmine, 17 years later, in 1616. The Roman Inquisition worked by case law and precedent. So if someone just 16 years before had been executed for believing in heliocentrism, that would have been an open and shut case in 1616. They wouldn't have put it to the assessors and gone out and asked people the evidence on the science behind heliocentrism. They would have just said, we've already done that 17 years ago, and we burnt this guy at the stake for it. Case closed. That didn't happen. So he wasn't put on trial for anything to do with heliocentrism. He was certainly put on trial for not believing that the Virgin Mary was a virgin, and saying that Jesus was a magician, and saying that that transubstantiation didn't happen. That'll get you burnt at the stake in 1599. Right? That'll get you burnt at the stake 3 times over. The thing that he probably was accused of was his ideas about multiple worlds, but that's not because that was an inherently heretical idea, because, as I mentioned, it was a papal nuncio and papal legate and cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, Nicholas of Cusa, who had first developed that idea within the context of Catholic theology. It was what he did with it was the problem. It was part of this sort of semi-mystical worldview that he believed he'd rediscovered after it had been lost by the ancient Egyptians. I mean, this guy was a fucking nutter. So for people to say he was a scientist who was burnt at the stake for believing in heliocentrism, that's just bullshit. Now, again, when I say this stuff, people go, you're excusing the Catholic Church for burning at the stake. I'm fucking not. I don't think anyone should be burnt at the stake for fucking anything, even if stuff that's wrong. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to use the example of Bruno in some kind of argument, you need to get your facts right. And anyone who says that he was a scientist is wrong. Anyone who says that he was some genius when it came to anything scientific was wrong. He was a bit of an idiot. And anyone who says that he was burnt at the stake for heliocentrism or for some kind of scientific conception of aliens on planets, completely wrong. That's a fairy tale. Make sense?
Yeah. So
yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. So here's a great one that I always love hearing, and I recently read our favorite biggest dickest carrier on it. Did the Christians burn down the Library of Alexandria because of all those pagan texts and everything?
Oh, you did not just invoke Alexandria. The holy the grail of knowledge. Take it away, Tim.
Okay. Short answer, no. They didn't. So where did this one come from? Well, basically, like a lot of these positivist myths that have permeated, unfortunately, have permeated free thinking and atheist thought. It can be traced back to Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire back in 1776. Gibbon was a great scholar, certainly a great scholar for his day, but he was writing before historians had to pay attention to pesky stuff like objectivity, and he was certainly writing before the development of the historical method as used by modern scholars today. So he had an agenda in a lot of his stuff, and one of his agendas was anti-Christian. He was a deist, but he was an ex-Christian. He flirted with Catholicism, and like a lot of people who adopted a form of Christianity in their youth and then rejected it, he kind of went very, very far the other way. So he was always looking for an opportunity to bash the Christians, and this was one of them. He effectively invented the myth that the Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed by Christians in the late 4th century AD. What actually happened was the Great Library had been in decline for quite a while when it was very much literally the royal library of the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. It had been well funded and well supported and well maintained, and that was very important for ancient libraries, because ancient libraries, the scrolls got destroyed, they fell apart from use. They were written on papyrus, which wasn't a highly durable material. Once the Romans got control of Egypt, they continued to maintain it, and there were some Roman emperors who, as patrons of the library, really took that seriously. The Emperor Claudius, for example, built a new wing and had it dedicated to him. Also got them to read one of his books aloud from start to finish as a public recitation at least twice a year. You can do that shit when you're a Roman emperor. But after that, the library did seem to go into something of decline. It did continue to exist, though, right into the 3rd century AD. And then there was a series of catastrophes in Alexandria, which seems to have brought it to an end. The most important of which was in 272, where the Emperor Aurelian laid siege to the city of Alexandria during a civil war and burnt the royal quarter in which the library stood. That seems to have been pretty much the end of it. The institution that the library served, the museum, possibly continued in some form afterwards, but it certainly didn't continue with this huge collection of books that had existed. The library itself probably had declined massively after the 1st century BC, when Julius Caesar, again in the siege of Alexandria, seems to, we think, have damaged a substantial portion of the library's collections by burning some warehouses that contain most of its books. But it certainly lasted until the 3rd century, until 272. And then not long after 272, there was a massive earthquake and a huge tsunami, which deposited ships on top of 3rd-story buildings in the upper reaches of Alexandria, completely wiped out the lower city where the royal quarter, where the library had once stood. So if there had been anything left after both Caesar in the 1st century BC and then in 272 Aurelian, the tsunami probably would have destroyed what was left. So that was the end of the Great Library of Alexandria. Notice that's in the 3rd century AD, before Christianity gets into any position to be burning down any libraries. So where does the story of the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria come from? Well, it's weird, but it comes from, Gibbon constructed it out of the story of the destruction of something else, and that was the Temple of Serapis, or the Serapeum. That was outside of the royal quarter, in the upper city. It was a huge temple, and it did have a large collection of books. It was considered a daughter library of the Great Library. The Great Library was exclusively used by the scholars who were part of the museum, and it was very much the royal library, whereas the daughter library in the Serapeum was one of 2 or maybe 3 daughter libraries. The daughter library in the Serapeum was open to the public. It was much smaller. We don't know how much, but we know that it still had an extensive collection of books well into the early 4th century and possibly a bit beyond. The problem, though, is the way that the whole story of the destruction of the library by Christians comes about is that the Temple of Serapis was torn down, not burned, torn down in the late 4th century. And that was in some quite remarkable circumstances, because what had happened was Alexandria by that stage had become a majority Christian city. There was still a strong pagan element in the city, and they formed the intellectual elite of the city, and they resented the rise of Christianity. Some Christians were renovating an old abandoned pagan temple. Keep in mind that paganism is very much in decline by this stage. And they were renovating this temple to turn it into a church. Down in the basement, they found some cult items from the cult of Mithras and possibly some other cults, which they then paraded through the streets in a kind of a mocking ceremony and then destroyed. Some pagans got very, very angry about this, particularly a group of pagan intellectuals who were part of the Neoplatonic school of Igambalus, and they decided to fight back. So they used the Serapeum as their base, ventured out into the street at night, dragged prominent Christians into the temple, and proceeded to torture and crucify them. Right? So this is the context. This went on for quite a while. Not surprisingly, the Christians were not terribly happy about that. The prefect of the city called out the troops, and there was a standoff. There was a siege of the Temple of Serapis. Both sides then petitioned the emperor, Theodosius, in Constantinople. Meanwhile, there was this standoff. So you had Roman troops and a large number of the Christian majority citizens of the city, and then you had these sort of fundamentalist pagan fanatics holed up in the temple. The emperor then intervened, and he said that the pagans were to be let go and could leave unmolested. But he said that he didn't want the temple to be used as a center for this kind of terrorist activity again, so he ordered that it should be torn down. The pagan philosophers left with their lives, later boasted about killing Christians and crucifying Christians and breaking Christians' legs and throwing them down wells. Lovely period of history. And then the troops moved in and started to tear the temple down. The crowd, who were angry at the fact that the terrorist guys got let off the hook, joined in. So this is where the story of the destruction of this temple that had held a library came from. That somehow gets mixed up with the story of Julius Caesar burning books, and it becomes Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria. Did Christians destroy a library when they destroyed the Temple of Serapis? Well, there's a major problem, two major problems with that idea. Gibbon assumed that they did. But we have 5 accounts of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, 2 of which are hostile to Christians, one of which is by a pagan philosopher who is ferociously anti-Christian, Eunapius. And none of those 5 accounts make any mention of any library. Now, you could potentially say that perhaps the Christians were embarrassed about it, and so they didn't mention it for that reason. But it doesn't make sense that Eunapius who is a vehement anti-Christian, a great scholar and a philosopher, would neglect to mention that in destroying this wonderful temple, this beautiful building, but in destroying this wonderful temple, the Christians had also destroyed the last remnant of the Great Library of Alexandria. Getting back to your friend Richard Carrier, he has argued against this idea, saying that Eunapius his account was too brief, and he didn't have enough room to mention this rather pertinent fact. Well, if you actually go and have a look at Eunapius's account, it's not brief, and he spends most of it talking about what idiots Christians are, and yet he forgets to mention that they destroyed this library. So the first problem is there's an argument from silence. We have 5 accounts, 2 of them hostile, one of them by a guy who spends most of the account tipping a bucket of shit on Christians. None of them mention any destruction of the library. Second problem. Before the destruction of the library, we have a description of destruction of the temple. We have a description of the temple by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He was a pagan. He was no particular fan of Christianity, and he also seems to have visited Egypt on his way back from campaigning with the Emperor Julian in the east. So he talks about, for example, visiting Thebes and seeing obelisks in Thebes. So he seems to have visited Egypt. He gives a description of the Temple of Serapis, and he describes it as being this magnificent building, which it clearly was. And he says it has held libraries, using the past tense. He was writing about 2 decades, maybe 15 years before the destruction of the temple, and yet he talks about his library in the past tense. The thing about libraries is that they were very expensive. And in this period, as I mentioned, Alexandria had become a majority Christian city, and a lot of these temples, there have been thousands of them, I think it was something like 20,000 temples in Alexandria, have been abandoned, like the one that I mentioned before. They've been abandoned because they didn't have the funds, they didn't have the money, their congregations were dwindling. So it's a bit like these days, maybe not in America, but here in Australia, you go to a lot of B&Bs or a lot of country accommodation, they're in converted churches because churches are closing down, because Christianity is shrinking, at least in this country. The same thing was happening. So what seems to have happened is that the Temple of Serapis, as magnificent as it was, struggled to maintain itself as its congregations dwindled, and as a result, the library seems to have basically fallen apart. There's a couple of episodes earlier where the temple was plundered. Books were probably stolen. So was there still a library when they tore the temple down? It doesn't look like it.
And the temple that the Christians were renovating, that was theirs. That was in their possession.
Yeah. Well, it had been abandoned. As far as we can tell, it had been abandoned. That was another temple. That seems to have been possibly a Mithraeum, so a temple of Mithras. It's hard to tell. We've only got a Christian account of that, so it's obviously pretty biased. But yeah, they weren't ashamed of the fact that they were, parading these enormous. Apparently, there were like gigantic phalluses that they were parading through the streets and mocking. It was a fun town. It's a fun town.
Yeah, I was going to say that probably wasn't the best choice. Not quite Christian love, but I don't see how you can, when you have an accurate view of history from multiple sources.
Yeah,
you come up with this legend, this myth. Well, and just by you retelling the different accounts, it's very easy to see how a myth could be brought out of a story from multiple angles.
Yes,
so
that's right. So what effectively has happened in that story is pretty much that. The version that most people hear, Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria, is a pastiche of some things that did happen and a whole lot of things that didn't. So, look, for example, quite often when you read the story of the destruction of the Temple of Serapis, the whole context that I gave you before is completely left out. So there's a book that came out a couple of years ago, which has unfortunately become a bit of a bestseller by a lady called Catherine Nixie, called The Darkening Age, something like the Christian destruction of the ancient world. And she tells the story of the Temple of Serapis. It forms a major part of one of her key chapters. She, for some reason, doesn't mention anything about the pagan guys holed up in the temple, crucifying people, breaking their legs and throwing them down wells. I wonder why. She doesn't mention that. So in her version of the story, there's this wonderful temple that's got this great big library in it, and then Christians spontaneously appear and start burning and destroying and looting for no reason.
Well, pagans never did that sort of thing.
They were lovely. They were lovely people. Yeah.
I got a whole book here. So wonderful book. The citations in it are absolutely amazing, and he says that that they didn't even crucify people.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. It's by Julian Doyle, the editor of Life of Brian. And he argues that there was that Jesus was never crucified. Here's his bibliography. If you look at Josephus, Tacitus, and freaking Gandhi, you'll notice errors in his bibliography.
Yeah.
He calls freaking Gandhi's book The Jesus Mystery. It's the Jesus Mysteries. He says that both works of Josephus were written in year 70. And he said that Tacitus' Annals of Rome were written in 79.
Really?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so he's got no fucking clue.
Oh no, he doesn't, and he rants online, and he has the biggest grudge in the world against me because I left a scathing review of his book. But I don't know where this trash keeps coming from.
No, but this is the funny thing. I mean, I get lots of appreciating mail, but I get a lot of hate mail, and it seems to come mainly from people who just love the fairy tales, and I'm happy to admit you don't like having some arrogant wanker like me come along and say that's all crap. But let's be frank, we're meant to be rationalists. There's plenty of bad stuff that Christianity has done that we can hit Christianity over the head with. It's not like there's a shortage of fucking material people. Why do we have to make crap up? And why do we have to adopt stupid theories just because it's anti-Christian? I was reading back over some stuff that I wrote in response to some of this stuff on an atheist forum a few years ago, and was just astonished at how boneheaded some of our fellow rationalists can be. It's just absolutely ridiculous. I was also astonished at my great patience. I think I'm becoming less patient. I just can't be asked doing that stuff anymore. This is one of the reasons why I started the blog, because that means I can write one article that sort of says, look, here's what the mainstream scholarship says, and then I can just post and say, look, here you are. If you say the Great Library was destroyed by Christians. That's wrong, and here's why, and then I can just move on. Which brings me, I suppose, to one of the criticisms that does get made on me, and that's that I'm not a professional historian, which I'm not, and I don't have a doctorate in history. I've got a master's in medieval literature, so yeah, that's fair. I'm just a dude. I'm a dude with a lot of books, but it's not like I'm making this stuff up, and it's not like I'm presenting some radical theory of my own, or even a fringe theory on any of these points. If I ever refer to something which isn't held by an overwhelming majority of scholars, or at least by scholars of a great degree of respectability, I always flag it, but I very rarely do. So my qualifications don't matter. The qualifications of the guys on the and women in the books that I've got behind me and all the other books that I refer to, they are the ones that matter. So this is this is an argument that I get all the time. Now, he's just a blogger. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Don't pay attention to me. Pay attention to the people that I cite, because I always make a point. Not in these conversations, obviously, because no one wants to be sitting here reading out strings of footnotes. But if they go to my blog and have a look at my blog, I always link to the key text that I'm referring to and quote the source material. Yeah,
it's also really interesting. I'm getting the same hate right now because I'm really vocal against mythicism.
Yeah,
extremely. I debated Godless Engineer on it, actually.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh. And dear old Godless Engineer. What a joy he is.
Yeah. I like John, but he's very stubborn, and he just verbatim copies Carrier.
That's right. Yeah.
It makes the debate very
well, you know what he's going to say. He's been wanting to debate me for a while, and I keep saying, and it doesn't matter who it is, whether it be Carrier or him or Fitzgerald or any of these people. I don't think debates are a great way. I mean, good, well done, Chris, if you've gone to the effort, but I don't think debates are a good way of working this stuff out. I think debates, all debates do really is tend to be exercises in rhetoric more than anything else. Also, I wouldn't debate the Godless Engineer guy because, no, I won't say that. Okay, because it would just be cruel. I mean, it's like punching a toddler or something. I mean, that guy really just doesn't have a clue.
Well, I would look at it this way. Not so much trying to change the mind of the person you're debating, but actually reach the audience, focusing on the audience and basically hitting them with facts. Because that's how I was able to change my mind on a whole variety of different issues, was listening to actual debates and going, and that's what I try to focus on when it comes to debating.
Sure. Sorry, Brian, but I suppose my point is, mythicism is such a huge topic that I've often said that if you wanted to do a debate that would do it justice, the debate would go for weeks. It would take weeks, because you would have to present the one argument, then there's the counter arguments to that, then there's counter arguments, the counter arguments, and then the counter to the counter and counter to the counter. And that's on every single little topic within the whole subject. It would take way too long. On small points, points, you probably could have a debate. So, did when Paul was writing about how Jesus was of the seed of born of the seed of David, did he mean that Jesus was constructed by God out of a cosmic bank of semen in the upper heavens? Now, you could have a debate about that.
Not because much of a debate, but
because the answer is no, he didn't mean that. But you can go through all of the and I did this with the guys on Non Sequitur. You can go through all the reasoning of Carrier and how he came up with that particularly stupid argument, and expose how his reasoning is flawed, how it's based on misreadings, how it's based on selective readings, and how it's based on some twisting of the words, and then it's just a wild flight of imagination. So on little things like that, you could certainly have a debate, I suppose. But to say that you could sit down and tackle mythicism in like an hour or 2 hours, it's impossible. It's impossible. Even Ernan only just sort of managed to skate over the surface in his debate with old Bob Price.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to bring up Ehrman because Ehrman, in one of his lectures, said during a question and answer, he's like, well, okay, so if I make a response book responding to this, and then it's going to be, 400 pages, then they respond back, and then you respond back, and pretty soon you've got 1,600 pages, and it's like, I don't have time for that. I get it.
I'm just doing other things with my life.
Right.
That's right. I mean, you can sort of see his exasperation and with Price, and every now and then. I mean, the funny thing is, the thing that debate showed me is when you actually put all of Price's arguments together and have him actually say it highlights exactly how silly it all is, particularly some bits of it. And you can just see the look on Ehrman's face, like, dude, are you seriously arguing that? You're seriously trying to argue that maybe Paul didn't exist? I mean, fuck off.
Or that Paul didn't write Galatians.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, but I suppose my question would be: has for example, the Ehrman-Price debate changed anyone's mind? I don't know that it has, or maybe it has, but I haven't come across anyone who said I watched that and now I think differently.
I've come across a few, but more often than not, it's just a bunch of people whining about, well, they should have just had him debate Carrier, and I'm like, yeah. Hey, did you watch it? Did you watch the debate between Carrier and William Lane Craig? William Lane Craig, one of the apologists I hate more than any other on the face of this earth, still managed to waffle stomp him.
Me too. And that gets back to my point about how debates generate a lot of heat but shed very little light. I mean, William Lane Craig is a complete wanker and is a sophist, but he's very good at the rhetoric. He's better than Carrier. Carrier's actually pretty good at the rhetoric as well. You watch his videos, and even when you know what he's saying is absolute bullshit, he says it with such great conviction. And he's very good at skating over the stuff that he's not saying and the counter arguments and so on. So I can see why people watch his stuff and go, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about.
Real quick. Oh, I'm sorry, real quick. Blood Cell 9 had a question. He says, can you ask Tim O'Neill, how did Christianity become the power frame within the Roman pagan powers? So I guess if you can understand it, I think it means, how did Christianity rise out of paganism? I don't know if you wanted to touch on that.
Sure. If the question is how did it become the dominant faith in the Roman Empire, am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's what it seemed to be to me.
Okay. A really good question. And actually, speaking about Ehrman, his latest book, The Triumph of Christianity, actually tackles that, and I think does a really good job. There are several books on this. Unfortunately, some of them by Christian apologists, which do a really bad job. They basically say because it was true, or because Jesus did rise from the dead, and so the martyrs were prepared to die for that idea, and various other flawed arguments like that. Effectively, Carrier, I think, does an excellent job of arguing that it was a matter of demographics. Effectively, the fact that Christianity was an exclusivist faith, which was actually made of quite unusual in the ancient world, meant that every time someone converted to Christianity, paganism lost someone. Right? But if someone changed their orientation or their focus of their religious beliefs within paganism, they didn't lose an adherent to the idea of a polytheistic universe. But when they converted to Christianity, that person that was it. They didn't believe in any other gods. They didn't worship any other gods. So it just meant that Christianity was slowly but exponentially growing. And as a result of that, eventually it got big enough for it to become a powerful force, powerful enough for a Roman emperor to adopt it as his faith. And the argument is that he didn't really convert to Christianity and he was actually a crypto-pagan and so on. That's just fucking bullshit as well. I'm going to write an article about that one of these days. But effectively what happened was that really did give it a bit of a boost. Ehrman, slip of the tongue. Ehrman argued that even if Constantine hadn't converted, the demographics would have worked the same way. So effectively, Christianity would eventually have become, simply because of its exclusivity and the way in which it amassed new converts, it eventually would have dominated. He may or may not be right. It depends on how you look at the demographics. But certainly having the emperor suddenly saying, you know what, all that funding that I used to give to, say, the Temple of Serapis, that's now going to go to Christianity. I'm going to use that to build basilicas and build churches. That had to make a difference. And when people sort of say, well, you know, why did Christianity then become the dominant religion in the world? Because it was adopted by Europe, and because Europe then went on to basically colonize and conquer the rest of the planet. So it's nothing to do with any, you know, Christians claim that must be because Christianity is true. Bullshit. It's got much more to do with sailing ships and gunpowder and cholera than it has to do with the inherent wonderfulness of Christianity.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I think that another part that also goes back to what you were talking about earlier, and how Christianity was taking a lot of pagan logic and pagan ideas, and it was more malleable that way. And so people were able to recognize a lot of similar ideas in it because they were adopting so many of them. And then we were like, okay, that, you know, it works. It's just simpler.
That's absolutely true. A lot of people look at Christianity, particularly people who don't like Christianity much, look at Christianity as though it was this alien thing that kind of descended from Mars and landed in the Roman Empire and was completely separate from and had no connection with the culture in which it landed. And that's absolute crap. Christianity arose in the culture of the Middle to Late Roman Empire and was very much part of it. So the intolerance for dissenting religious ideas that we start to see amongst the Christian emperors really from the late 4th and definitely into the 5th and 6th centuries was really just an extension of what we started to see with Roman emperors back in the 3rd century. That was very much a tendency in that world before Christianity was adopted by the emperors. Same with a lot of the ideas within Christianity, a lot of the philosophical underpinnings of Christianity came from Neoplatonism. So there had already been a tendency towards believing in a single God, or something like a single God. The one was the way in which the Neoplatonics referred to it, and believing in a kind of a cosmology that was very similar to the cosmology of Christianity. The two kind of merged. Whereas a lot of the schools of philosophy of the ancient Greeks and Romans that we find much more accessible. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Stoics, for example, and there were various others as well. You know, the Epicureans. Those guys were already on the way before Christianity. So it's not like Christianity came along and killed all that stuff. The Neoplatonic, particularly the Neoplatonic, and to a certain extent the Aristotelian schools, were pretty much dominant by the time Christianity came along. Christianity kind of merged with a form of Neoplatonism.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it ridiculous when, you know, theologians and apologists will be, you know, Christianity was, you know, this whole new revolutionary thing. Like, in some ways, yes.
Kind of, yeah, like, because it introduced some new ideas, yeah.
Right, but to argue that it wasn't like greatly inspired by the Greeks and especially the Jewish diaspora, that in particular is like the biggest thing, because, you know, you have Paul. The biggest indication is, you know, Paul uses a lot of the same language as Philo, but they use it in completely different ways, indicating that, you know, that what had happened is that there was a diaspora and the people were becoming familiar with Greek terminology, but everyone had a different idea of how to use it.
Yeah, so there's a good book that came out a couple of years ago called the Crucible of Faith. Came out last year by a guy called Philip Jenkins, where he basically says you can't look at the Judaism out of which Christianity arose, again, as being this thing that was completely separate from the rest of the ancient Greco-Roman world. Judaism had been heavily influenced by Greek thought for 200 years before Christianity. And actually that 200 years before Christianity was when most of the ideas that we now associate with the Christian religion, you know, heaven, hell, an apocalypse, Messiah, angels in armies battling armies of demons, all that stuff arose. And a lot of it actually arose from this sort of commixture of commingling of Greek ideas, traditional Hebrew ideas, you know, Jewish ideas, and Persian ideas. And Christianity grew out of that kind of mix. So he calls that the crucible of faith. And I'd highly recommend that book. I think that's an excellent thing to read if you want to understand how Christianity arose out of Judaism, and also how Christianity then became enmeshed with the world of Greek and Roman thought. It wasn't some alien thing that came from nowhere.
Yeah. So one thing I do want to ask, what are some of your favorite false parallels that are commonly drawn, especially in like mythicist circles, between Christianity and pagan religions?
Okay. Well, there's so many. Well, the one I like, I mean, I dislike, I have a genuine, healthy dislike and skepticism about any theory that sort of says, here's a parallel, therefore the two are connected and one was derived from another. I have an immediate visceral reaction. So sometimes those arguments can be upheld and are valid, but most of them are crap. So there's a hell of a lot of those in the whole sort of New Age wing of mythicism, where it all rose out of pagan gods, and it's just pagan gods rebadged. So one of the things that you get are these parallels that kind of aren't. So you sort of get things like, well, Jesus was crucified on a cross. The cross is made of wood. It's a bit like a tree. Attis either was nailed to a tree, or was tied to a tree, or turned into a tree. So that's a parallel. To which I go, fuck off. That's just fucking ridiculous. And there's a heap of that stuff. Bacchus was born of a virgin. Well, okay, kind of. He was taken and sewn into the thigh of Zeus and was born out of Zeus's thigh. Is that a virgin birth? I don't know. I mean, Zeus fucked his mother to begin with, so she wasn't a virgin. She was a virgin before. She wasn't a virgin afterwards. Any god who is born, or demigod, or god-man who is born of the sex between a god and a human is counted as a virgin birth. Well, if that's a virgin birth, then I think people need to go back to sex education school, because that's not virginity, guys, right? So the fact that, I mean, are there parallels between the Jesus virgin birth story and the stories of various others? Yeah, there are. And I do think that some of those actually influenced the Jesus story. But the Jesus story, like many of these things, actually grew out of various progenitors, and one of those was the Jewish tradition of a holy man - prophet who was born in remarkable circumstances to someone who shouldn't be able to give birth. So you've got, for example, Isaac being born from a mother who was infertile. You had Samuel being born from a mother who was too old. You had various, the stories of John the Baptist being born from a mother who was too old, who had passed menopause. And then you get this story of Jesus who was being born from a virgin. It's in the same tradition. So was it influenced by the virgin birth? There are some actual virgin birth stories in the ancient world that aren't just gods fucking humans. Is it influenced by that? Yeah, probably. As I said before, Christianity didn't arise out of absolutely nothing. But a lot of the so-called parallels. I mean, the one that annoys me the most is Mithras. We're told that Mithras had 12 disciples and that he performed miracles and that he was crucified and died and ascended to heaven and all that stuff. And I say to people, okay, show me where in any ancient text any of this stuff is mentioned. Show me. And they never can. And they always just quote some other, Acharya S or someone who makes these claims. And the answer is that this stuff is all just crap. And it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and then people don't bother to fucking check their facts. Now, there are a couple of very minor parallels between Mithraism and Christianity, but not many. I mean, they both had a weekly meeting where they drank wine and ate bread. But then again, drinking wine and eating bread bread was the staple and wine was the main drink. So that's like saying, well, you've got these two cults today, and afterwards they drank coffee and ate some cake. That doesn't mean that there was some kind of religious parallel. It just means that the cults in the same cultural environment. So most of that parallel stuff is bullshit.
Yeah, my favorite ones are dying and rising gods, and particularly because of the way Carrier uses them, and he misattributes when he does it. It's element 31 or whatever in OHJ.
Yeah.
And it's hilarious because he does almost nothing with it in the entire book. It kind of just exists there to pad out runtime.
There's a bit of that in the early parts of the book, I must say.
Oh yeah,
where are you going with this, dude? And then it just stops. Yeah.
Yep, and then he'll say like he's gonna bring it up later, and he never does. It's really funny.
Yeah.
But the best part though is on the like third page dealing with that. You look at the footnote, and one thing is very peculiar. When he cites Tryggve Mettinger, who's like the only scholar in the entire world left that argues for dying and rising gods,
Yep.
he doesn't cite page numbers. When he cites, then he cites Mark S. Smith as defending a dying and rising Baal, even though Mark S. Smith in one of the very books that Carrier cites argues against it and has a paper arguing against it. Also, he never cites page numbers there. And then he cites Dr. Freimer Kensky. And lo and behold, in the very paper that Carrier cites, Tikva actually says that Marduk is not a dying and rising god and agrees with von Soden's approach. And it's really funny because after that he says, read this paper in light of Mettinger's analysis. Mettinger agrees with von Soden that Marduk is not a dying and rising god.
This is something that these guys do a lot. I mean, it's sort of like cherry picking, but the other thing that they do quite a bit is well, here are some people who agree with me, and on this particular thing. Therefore, those people are right. And the thing about New Testament studies is, I'm sure you know, Chris and Brian, you're probably working out, is that it's such a well-trodden field that if you look hard enough, you'll find someone who has argued something, anything, somewhere. It doesn't matter how left field or even implausible some of these interpretations are. You can find them, and I quite often have people say, "Well, you're ignoring this scholar here." So, well, yeah, I am, probably because he's kind of out there on his own, you know, or maybe there's two of them who think that. You had this is how I kind of got in touch with you originally, Chris. But you had that guy Cam, I think his name was, who was
yeah, he's a friend of mine.
Okay, right, and look, I don't want to be mean about Cam because he did say some very nice things about me, but he was talking about how I don't accept some critical theories that he thinks are true. Now, I don't know why he brought that up as an argument against me being particularly well read, unless he's using himself as a touchstone for scholarliness or something. But I get the impression he believes Dennis MacDonald's theories about mimesis and how the Gospel of Mark is based on Homer, which is also another one of Carrier's favourite ideas. Whereas I don't find that convincing at all. And I don't find that convincing because it's basically because virtually no one, apart from people like Carrier, are convinced by it. And it's not just that New Testament scholars aren't convinced by it. I've read some excellent critiques of it. One great review of it by a Homer scholar who said, look, I don't know much about the Gospel of Mark, but this guy's completely off base when he talks about the way in which Homer was used in the ancient world. So, yeah, you know, if you want to, you can go and you can find someone like Dennis MacDonald. And does MacDonald make a coherent argument? Yeah, I think he does. Is it convincing? Not to me, and certainly not to most scholars, including many non-Christian scholars. So it's easy to go out there and find people who will support bits and pieces. The interesting thing is that Carrier, for example, if you go and check his footnotes, which most of his fans don't do, and it sounds like you've been having fun with this one, Chris, but if you go and check his footnote, what you'll find is that he's really cobbling together a whole lot of stuff, mostly by people who do accept that there was a historical Jesus, but he takes a bit here and a bit there, and he kind of makes this sort of bricolage, this sort of pastiche of ideas, and then says, look at how scholarly my work is. I've actually had people say to me, when I've said Carrier's book is deeply unconvincing, actually say, but he has lots of footnotes. And so that's an argument, you know, which is probably up there with, but he's got a PhD from Columbia with, you know, so.
Oh, that's another really fun one too. I've been another footnote of his where he cites Mircea Eliade. It seems like everyone who cites Mircea Eliade has no idea what Mircea Eliade actually says.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest indicator that Carrier had no idea what he was saying was that he didn't cite page numbers again. But he cites him for Zalmoxis because Eliade was just obsessed with Zalmoxis.
Yeah.
Eliade's opinion of Zalmoxis was that he underwent a catabasis.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He did not die and rise. And in fact, when Eliade wrote in his book, Zalmoxis the Vanishing God, when he talked about him, every time he used the word death in relation to Zalmoxis, he put it in quotation marks.
This is the standard argument against that whole dying rising God thing, and I think Ehrman probably overstates his case when he talks about it, because I think that there possibly are a couple of examples of people who actually did die, gods who actually do die and then do rise again, but not many. And most of the ones that we do get cited, as you just used with that example of Zalmoxis, either didn't die or did die but didn't rise. Or Osiris is the classic example of did die but didn't rise. Somehow we're supposed to see the resurrection, in inverted commas, of Osiris as a parallel with Jesus. Well, I must have missed the bit where Jesus dies, gets eaten by fish, has his body put back together by his wife, who then straps a dildo on it and impregnates herself with their son. I'm pretty sure I would have been much more interested in Christianity if it had shit like that in the Bible, but my Bible was missing that stuff. You know? That would have been cool.
Or missing the part where he's never raised back to life. I've always described it as the best way to describe Osiris is that he's raised to an afterlife. He's the literal definition of an afterlife.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's never in the land of the living again, whereas Jesus' resurrection is literally a physical, bodily, earthly resurrection.
Well, at least in the Gospels, anyway. I mean,
in the Gospels.
It's debatable whether Paul thought that, but it certainly developed into that idea. Yeah.
Right, but it's like the Osiris parallel. I have no stock in. The only dying and rising gods I actually think were possibly a thing were Inanna is a clear example in the Sumerian, not in the Akkadian literature. She's not in the Sumerian literature. She is, but I think Mettinger's analysis of Baal is actually more correct than Mark S. Smith's, and I think Baal was likely dying and rising. But the interesting thing is that with every case of a dying and rising god, there's no evidence of their worship or practice or those beliefs actually still occurring during the time of Jesus.
Right.
The only one you can quasi argue is Tammuz, but Tammuz most likely underwent like a bilocation.
Yeah, and this, that's right. I mean, it's not to say that these ideas weren't around, and it's not to say they didn't have some influence on the way in which the resurrection stories, as they developed, or as they were received. But it's a big leap to go from there are some parallels or even some potential influences to it's a derivation. And as I said, I'm deeply suspicious of any argument that jumps from parallel to derivation, because it's a very difficult thing to prove or even argue with any degree of coherence.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I just liken it to mostly parallelomania. Most of the time, it's just people seeing what they want to see.
Yeah.
And then the rest of the time, even if they're legitimate parallels, it's just ridiculous to try and argue that just because there are legitimate parallels that could actually be connected, that is just this plain and simple derivation. That's just not how religious syncretism works.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's like my biggest argument with dying and rising gods and against their use in this literature is because when we look at religious syncretism, one of the biggest things that it tends to do is leave leftovers of what was before. Yahweh's merging with Baal, we find a lot of leftovers, like Leviathan. We find carbon copies of the Leviathan stories from the Baalic literature. It's just been taken completely over and merged into the Yahwistic cult. What we don't find, though, is leftovers of resurrection cults of the ancient Near East in the Bible.
Yep.
We just don't find it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why very little in the resurrection stories seem to have any kind of actual narrative connections to that material. What you can actually do, though, is if you look at the resurrection stories, you can see how they grew out of each other. So you can see development in, the one I love is you compare the resurrection story in Mark to the resurrection story in Matthew. It's remarkable, particularly when you think about the fact that the writer of Matthew had Mark's account right in front of him, and yet has stuff that's completely different, like angels descending and landing, opening the tomb and sitting on it, and earthquakes and saints rising and wandering through the streets of Jerusalem. None of this is in his source, which really makes you kind of think about, well, what were these guys doing when they were writing this stuff? Did they obviously didn't see themselves as writing documentary journalism.
That's what was going to be my question. What do you think was influencing their writing? I mean, because many of these authors, well, there's only 4, but some of these authors were well removed from the area that these events took place.
Yeah. So I think, well, that example, and the fact that the writer of the Gospel of Matthew is sitting there and he's reading the very bald and quite different account of the resurrection in Mark, and then he writes his account that has, flying angels, rolling stones, and parading zombies. So what he obviously wasn't doing was simply saying, well, I'm going to take this account and tell it in a slightly different way. He was saying, well, I don't think this account is quite saying the theological stuff that I want to say. So I'm going to actually add a whole lot of elements that say this theological stuff. So the problem with the hell of a lot of our fellow atheists is that many of them, particularly because they come out of a fundamentalist or biblical literalist Christian culture, they tend to read the Gospels as though they should be read as journalistic, historical account, where actually what they are is polemical works of theology. And once you understand that, then you can sort of see why there are the differences that there are, and you can see how the stories evolved in the way in which they did. So what were they doing? They were trying to say Jesus was the Messiah, and they were trying to say Jesus has gone on to heaven, he's risen, and he's coming back with the apocalypse. That's certainly the first 3 Gospels. John had a slightly a different Christology and a different agenda. So when you start to read it in that sense, suddenly the fact that there are contradictions between these Gospels make a hell of a lot of sense. They're trying to say the same thing, but they're putting emphasis on different stuff, theological stuff. And sure, they're adding stories and they're putting dialogue in Jesus' mouth and doing all of that stuff. And that's why we're getting the differences that we've got. So to sit and read them and say, well, they don't make sense as a whole, and they certainly don't make sense as a group. So it's all nonsense, and we can throw it all away. There's nothing historical in there at all. Is completely wrong-headed. And I think we were talking about that before. People who can only think in absolutes. So either it's all true, or it's all mythical, or fictional is the word that people keep misusing.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to this question in the chat. Ask him if Jesus came back on the 3rd day because the manuscripts say it. I'm not sure why. Well,
what?
Why?
No.
There's nothing. I think this may have been a joke because.
Oh, okay. Right.
I hope it was a joke because no one in the chat believes he came back.
Okay, sorry. I think I know what's going on there. Quite often when people, it kind of gets back to what I was just saying. Quite often when people sort of hear me referring to bits of the Gospels and saying, and so we can kind of extrapolate back from that to something that may have happened historically. People say, well, just because it's in the Gospels doesn't mean it happened. So they seem, again, it's this all or nothing thing. They seem to think that just because I'm making reference to the Gospels and saying, well, some of that stuff, him existing, for example, may have happened, therefore I have to accept everything. No, I don't.
Right.
No, I don't. That doesn't. And why the hell would you? You don't take any ancient source at face value. What you do is you look at what does that source tell me about what that person believed, and then how did those beliefs arise? Where are they getting that idea from? When you trace some of those ideas back, you can actually get to a point where you say, well, actually, that only really makes most sense if something like that or that actually happened. So I always argue that the Gospels fall into three categories. The stuff in the Gospels fall into three categories. First category is stuff that almost certainly didn't happen. Now, we can, those of us who are rationalists and don't believe in the supernatural anyway, we can agree that the walking on water and feeding the 5,000 and, of course, the fucking resurrection did not happen, right?
Yeah.
So that falls into that category. There's other stuff that falls into that category as well that we can be pretty sure probably didn't happen. So Pilate having a tradition of releasing a criminal into the hotbed of unrest that was the Passover crowd every year, that's almost certainly bullshit. It's a narrative device, and it's there to have this guy Barabbas, whose name, funnily enough, just happens to mean son of the Father. He gets released. In some manuscripts, he's even called Jesus Barabbas. He gets released. He's a bad guy. He gets released and he lives. Jesus, he's a good guy. He doesn't get released and he gets crucified. So it's a piece of rhetoric. So that almost certainly didn't happen because, one, it doesn't make sense, and two, it's pretty obviously a piece of theological rhetoric. So then there's the second category, which is things that may have happened, but we've got no way of actually determining whether they did or not. And actually, most of the Gospels fall into this category. So if you look at the Gospels, very little of it is actually Jesus walking on water and flying off into the sky. Most of it is Jesus went here and said this. Jesus went here and told a story. Jesus went here and exorcised someone who thought he was possessed by demons. Someone asked Jesus a question and he answered, and Jesus told a parable. Most of it's that. Now, did any of that stuff happen? I don't fucking know. Some of it could have been. Some of it could have happened. A lot of it, particularly the stuff in the early Gospels, which is clearly apocalyptic preaching, is the kind of stuff that someone like Jesus probably would have said. But did it happen? Did he actually go to Capernaum? Did he go to Peter's house? Don't know. We can't tell. But there's a final small but substantial category of stuff in the Gospels, which when we look at it only really makes sense if it did happen, or most likely did happen. So the one example I quite often use is the baptism of Jesus by John. In the Gospel of Mark, that is presented in a very bald, very brief fashion. It says that people were going, all of Jerusalem apparently, were going to have their sins washed away by John, by being baptized, immersed in the River Jordan. And then it says, and then Jesus went and he got baptized too. That's it. Now Jesus hears a voice, the so-called Bath Kol, the voice of God or the voice from the heavens, saying, "You are my son with whom I'm well pleased." No one else hears that voice in that version. And then Jesus goes off into the desert to have a chat with Satan. That's it in the Gospel of Mark. The thing in Mark is that Mark seems to be presenting that, which is right at the beginning, it's in Mark 1, seems to be presenting that as the point where Jesus became the Messiah. So for him, there's no problem with John baptizing this guy for the forgiveness of his sins, because at that point, God speaks from the heavens and says to Jesus, you are literally my anointed one. You are my son, the Son of God. The problem, though, comes when Matthew and Luke are trying to depict Jesus as being the Messiah from the moment of his conception. So that means that by the time he gets to the point where he's being baptized by John, they have a problem. This means that John is forgiving the sins of the exalted Messiah of God. And that doesn't work with their Christology. So Luke does a very subtle thing, and he actually tells a story about Jesus being acknowledged by John when they were both in the womb. So Mary goes and visits her kinswoman Elizabeth, and she says, I felt my child jump with joy in the womb. So Luke somehow has John acknowledging Jesus as a superior. Matthew is less subtle, because Matthew is always less subtle. So Matthew actually puts a bit of dialogue in where John says, I shouldn't be baptizing you, you should be baptizing me. And then Jesus says something very weird about, no, this is to fulfill all righteousness. And so he gets baptized anyway. Clearly these two guys are having trouble with the idea of Jesus' supposed Messiah being baptized by his inferior. The Gospel of John deals with it by taking the baptism out altogether. So if you go to the Gospel of John, John is saying the Messiah is coming, and then Jesus turns up and he says, "Oh, there he is." No baptism.
Behold the Lamb of God.
Exactly. So what's going on here is the idea that Jesus was baptized by John is clearly very deep in the tradition. And so what they can't do is they can't take it out altogether. The Gospel of John comes closest to doing so. But they all have to put in this encounter between Jesus and John right at the beginning of his career. But they all deal with it in different ways. This seems to indicate that the idea that Jesus was baptized by John was deep in the tradition because it happened. And particularly the Markan account seems to indicate that it not only happened, but it was the triggering event that kicked off Jesus' own conception of himself as a prophet and possibly his own conception of himself as Messiah. Maybe, we don't know. But certainly this event seems to be something that is very likely to have been historical because of the awkward way in which the Gospels have to try and deal with it as their conception of Jesus evolves and changes. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes. Now, this is going to be a topic of discussion for a future podcast, but I would really love to get into the historicity of John the Baptist and his following. And I mean, we don't have to get into it now, but that is starting to fascinate me.
Okay.
The idea of John the Baptist not being as portrayed in the Gospels, but a real life figure where his followers were a little on the fringe side, shall we say?
Well, I think just quickly on that, because it is an interesting topic, and there've been there's whole books written on it, as there are whole books written on pretty much everything in this field. But I would say that the evidence that would indicate that John actually was a real guy. He's mentioned by Josephus. And it's interesting that mythicists who are desperate to argue against the historicity of Jesus usually accept the historicity of John without a great deal of problem, despite the fact we're largely depending on the same sources and we actually have much less material about John. But I think, again, that stuff about Jesus being baptized by John seems to indicate that the early Jesus sect was getting some of its legitimacy from the fact that Jesus had been acknowledged in some way by John. That's another reason why that story seems to be in the tradition. But if you then look at other stuff in the Gospels that mentions John, he seems to have forgotten that he acknowledged Jesus as the Messiah, because at one point he sends some of his followers, when he's in jail, he sends some of his followers to question Jesus and say, "Are you the Messiah, or should we be expecting someone else?" He also seems to have forgotten that he was related to Jesus. That bit gets completely. Yeah.
I was going to say, the Baptists have the most perfect explanation for the baptism of Jesus and for John the Baptist's doubt.
Oh, okay.
John the Baptist, in his moment of he's in prison, he's being threatened with death. He has a moment of weakness where he questions, he doubts. Is this really true? Is Jesus who he says he was? So this is just a human moment for John. Now, okay. Well, the baptism, this is Jesus showing what he's going to be doing later on the cross, because baptism, as you know, is the death, burial, and resurrection. So it's all, I mean, there's an explanation for everything, but I mean, in the way you walked us through it, how John the Baptist deals with Jesus and how different things are said that kind of don't quite match up. When you look at it from a secular point of view, it's very interesting how the idea of Jesus changed. As far as in Mark, he's more of a person with cause, and then by the time you get to John and Matthew, he is just he's even more awesome, more bigger, more better, more,
Yeah.
So same thing with John,
A couple of points on that. But first of all, on that last point, and it is quite clear that the Jesus of Mark, and to a certain extent Matthew, and then to a lesser extent Luke, and is quite different to the Jesus of John, and that's because the Jesus of the first three Gospels is very much an apocalyptic Jesus. He gets less and less as you go through, but he's very much a Jesus who's preaches the coming apocalypse and is therefore going to come back when the apocalypse comes, which is coming very, very soon. By the time we get to John, all that is starting to fade, and the apocalypse, the coming kingdom of God, ceases to be the focus. Jesus becomes the focus. And so this formerly very Jewish apocalyptic sect is turning into a almost post-Jewish, much more Gentile savior cult. And that's effectively what Christianity went on to become. Bits of the apocalyptic elements continue, and we still have that within Christianity to this day. But on the whole, that's the progression that we can see. Second point, it's interesting that we do have a very human Jesus in the early stuff and a very divine Jesus in the late stuff, because that's exactly the opposite of what we should expect if mythicism was true. So if Jesus was historicized from a divine celestial being, well, then we really should have a much more divine Jesus at the beginning, and he gets more human as we get through to the later text. Well, we actually get exactly the opposite. So what we get makes sense if you had an apocalyptic preacher who came to see himself as the Messiah, or certainly they came to see as the Messiah, that then develops into this savior, and then eventually becomes increasingly deified until he becomes the second person of the Holy Trinity. The other interesting thing about the John stuff, I find the John stuff fascinating. I do tend to go back to that quite a bit, because what you find in the John stuff is an interesting parallel between Jesus and John, in that both are apocalyptic preachers, both have major followings, both fall afoul of the authorities, both get arrested, both get executed, and then both have stories told about them rising from the dead. And this is an interesting point, because when Herod first hears about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, he says, maybe this is John the Baptist. And when Jesus is talking to his disciples and saying, who do people say that I am? And they say, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets, some say that you are John the Baptist. Well, how can you be John the Baptist? Well, if you look at that, that's after John the Baptist has been executed. Right? So the idea that...
yes.
Right? So the idea that Christians say, well, he must have risen from the dead, because otherwise that story wouldn't have arisen. Well, that's bullshit. It obviously arose about John the Baptist. Even in Acts, you get a depiction of Paul coming across some people baptizing in Greece, and he asked, are you baptizing in the name of Jesus? And they said, no, we're doing the baptism of John. So not only did he get executed and did stories arise about him rising from the dead, John, but his cult continued, his sect continued, and expanded into Greece. And then we've got the Mandaeans, who claim that they're actually descended from and followers of John, and in some of their scriptures describe Jesus as the false prophet. So in other words, it didn't just happen once that an apocalyptic preacher got executed and people thought that he rose from the dead and then went to preach his word. It happened twice, and in the same social and religious context.
That is a very interesting perspective. I never thought of that. Wow.
Yeah, it's really one thing that's really interesting is when you were talking about how it basically what we get is like the opposite of what we would expect with mythicism.
Yeah.
It's really funny, because if mythicism were true and what they argue is what would have happened, it would have actually been very similar to what happened to Baal, because Baal, he back in Ugarit, he's this great divine warrior, storm god, dies and rises from what we can kind of tell from the Ugaritic Baal cycle, and then as time goes on, he starts losing a lot of that mythology. Okay. And by the time we get to Philo of Byblos, who's like our last major source on Canaanite religion, and he's being quoted by Eusebius, the account of Baal, of all the Phoenician deities is like quasi-euhemeristic.
Right.
And so if mythicism were right, we should not actually have a dying, rising Jesus.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and this is the thing. I mean, I remember the first time I ever came across anyone arguing for mythicism back in the late '90s, arguing online for mythicism. I remember saying to them, if he was if he was some kind of celestial or allegorical figure who became historicized, why the hell does he look so much like an apocalyptic prophet? Well, that's a very weird thing to turn your God into. And why is he in Galilee, of all places?
Yeah, why is he in Odunkville?
Exactly. And why make him Jesus of Nazareth, of all places? None of this makes any sense. Unless, of course, he was that, right? And the Jesus Christ of Christianity developed out of the earlier conceptions, as I said, of him as first as Messiah, not as God, but as Messiah, and then before that as a prophet.
Yeah, the whole remember, a prophet has no honor in his own hometown. I'm just saying. Okay.
But
we all know you. Don't pull that on us. We know who you are. Go away.
The whole Nazareth one is also a really funny is a really funny little coincidence too. It's like, why on earth? So if he's not actually from Nazareth, why is it that they spent all this time trying to get him from Nazareth to Bethlehem?
Yeah. So I've just been reading some quite complicated debate about that, where a mythicist is desperately trying to get around the Nazareth thing, and what they usually try and do is say, well, the Nazareth thing was a misunderstanding. He was actually a Nazarite, or he was a Nazir, a holy one of God. So they're not saying Jesus of Nazareth. He's actually saying Jesus, the Holy One of God. I won't go into the details, but that doesn't work linguistically. But beyond that, if that's the case, why do the Gospels consistently depict him coming from Nazareth? Some mythicists try to say that the one reference to him coming from Nazareth in Mark 1, right at the beginning of the Gospel, is an interpolation. Because if all else fails, if you're a mythicist, you just make the evidence go away by saying it's an interpolation. But basically, all of the Gospels have him coming from Nazareth. Now, the problem there, as you've just touched on, Chris, the problem there is that the Messiah apparently was meant to come from Bethlehem. And here they are saying this guy, Jesus, who was from Nazareth, was the Messiah. And you actually have a passage in John, I forget the verse, where someone says, well, he can't be the Messiah. The Messiah is meant to be from Bethlehem. And no one actually says, oh, by the way, here's how it will work. There was a census and angels and stuff. Right? It just sort of drops that line as an objection to the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. So this is why we find in Matthew and Luke these convoluted stories, which are historically riddled with problems, they're highly implausible, and which contradict each other, both of which, as you say, are all about getting a guy from Nazareth born in Bethlehem. One of them has his family go to Bethlehem for a census and he gets born there and then they go home. The other one has them start in Bethlehem, they have to run away via Egypt, and then they end up settling in Nazareth. Neither of them make any sense. Both of them are riddled with historical problems. They contradict each other because one's set before 4 BC, the other's set 6 AD, so they're 10 years apart. What's going on? This is what's going on. They're trying to find a way that a guy that they believed was the Messiah could fit with the Bethlehem prophecy, despite the fact he was from fucking Nazareth. What does that tell us? It tells us that he was from Nazareth. It tells us they're shoehorning a historical guy into this Messiah idea, despite the fact he doesn't actually fit very well. And that tells us that Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, is a historical element.
Yeah, well, and the rebuttal I typically run across, unfortunately, because I tend to be in circles that read Renee's Psalm.
Ah, Renee's Psalm. The piano tuner from Oregon, yeah.
Makes me want to just, bash my skull out, but it's that Nazareth didn't exist. And I'm like, I contacted actual excavators of Nazareth about this. I actually emailed them, and they're like, no, we literally have a first-century farmhouse.
Yeah. Who did you contact? Can you recall?
Alexandria.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Years ago, I've had some run-ins with Salm, and one of these days I've got to write an article on the whole Nazareth myth sideshow. I mean, it is a sideshow. Whether it came from, whether Nazareth existed or not is not really a major plank in the mythicist idea, except it does help to get around the argument that I just laid out. But yeah, years ago I contacted Dr. Ken Dark, who wrote a critique of Salm's book, and said, look, there's a couple of things I just want to clarify. He wrote back and said, I'm sick of that guy. I'm a working archaeologist. Frankly, I'm not interested. I thought, fair enough, that's fine.
Yeah.
But then Alexandria did respond. That's good to hear.
Yeah. Oh, no, yeah. I asked her, like, do we have any evidence of Nazareth in the first century? And she was like, yeah, I'm excavating it.
Well, years ago, Salm used to cite some of her work with the usual sort of selective cherry picking, and he interpreted some of her work as supporting one of his arguments. Then she got mentioned as having found early Roman and Hasmonean coins in a site at Nazareth, which didn't help him. So then he tried to claim, because he heard that secondhand from Rapuano and a couple of other scholars, Fan and Rapuano. He said, "Oh well, why hasn't she published it? This is very suspicious." And they responded and said, "Well, she's going to." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it." A couple of years later, she did. And now Salm is saying, well, but here's a problem with those coins. It doesn't matter with that guy. It doesn't matter what evidence you show him. He's always got a way around it. He's a nutter.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you've ever seen him interviewed or anything. Like he talks as though he is the great authority, and he's a piano tuner in Oregon. He's been to Nazareth as a tourist. He went there once as a tourist. No archaeology degree. No, all he does is he does what creationists do when they're nitpicking at evolutionary biology, or particularly paleontology. He jumps on anything that he can twist. So if something gets mislabeled in a report, that's evidence that there's some great conspiracy. He doesn't just say these people are wrong, by the way. He actually believes, he calls it Nazareth Gate, he actually believes that there is a conspiracy by Jewish archaeologists, the Israeli Archaeological Foundation, and of course all the Christians, because of the tourist trade. It's fucking bonkers. It really is. But the weird thing is the number of supposedly sensible, relatively sensible mythicists who back this stuff, and don't seem to notice the way in which he's fiddling with the data. He does, for example, there's a particular type of oil lamp that was found in Nazareth, and they're often referred to as Herodian lamps, as in from the period of Herod, also known as bow-spirited lamps. He has to shift these lamps out of the window in which Jesus existed, so he has to make them either later or earlier. So what he does is he says, well, they seem to have arisen a bit later than Herod's time, which is true. So therefore, they only actually came into existence around about, probably around about the beginning of the first century. Problem is, that's roughly when we're talking about Jesus. So what he has to do then is say, well, they've only been found in Judea, dating from that period. So it must have taken a period of time for them to be adopted in Galilee, 2 days walk north. So he then pulls out of his ass the idea that it would have taken 50 years for this type of lamp to go from Judea to Galilee, and then says, so that puts it in the middle of the first century, therefore it doesn't indicate that Nazareth was existed in the early first century AD. That's the kind of shit that he does. And yet
I haven't gotten his book yet.
Oh yeah, I've been through it in great detail.
I'm planning on it because I'm writing my own book on mythicism, and so it's gonna unfortunately burn through some of my time. But oh my god! so by his logic, it should have taken like 1,000 years for me to get tin in Egypt.
Probably.
During the Bronze Age, like, oh, you know, copper's in Crete, so, you know, it's going to take me 80 years to finally get my shipment of copper from Crete. Like, what the fuck?
It's stuff like that, you know. And when you poke, again, he's another one of these guys who's pretty good at the rhetoric, and he just does this gish gallop of, you know, his book is you know, footnotes and all the rest of it. It's fantastic stuff until you actually start to pull apart the arguments. And what you find is that he's doing this kind of fancy footwork the whole time. If you want to, Chris, I've got several of the relevant articles on this, including Ken Dark's critique of his book. So
please, I would love those.
Yeah, just remind me. I'll send that to you.
Yeah, I'll email you from the Biblical History Skeptic Gmail.
Cool. Guys, I'm running out of time, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Oh man,
I was just about to close up because I knew you've got a life outside of YouTube.
Yeah, there was so much. I wanted to even ask you about the monk that discovered flight before.
Yeah, Elmer of Malmesbury, one of my favorite dudes. Yeah, so yeah, you ask anyone who came up with the idea of flight, and they'll always say Leonardo da Vinci, because Leonardo da Vinci drew a very pretty picture of a machine that wouldn't fly. Whereas Elmer of Malmesbury, back in the 11th century, there was a monk at Malmesbury Abbey, was an astronomer, and was very interested in the flight of birds. Built basically a glider, had it dragged to the top of the Malmesbury Abbey church, launched himself off, and flew a distance of about 2 football fields until he crashed into a tree and broke both his legs. Now that's possibly the first most reliable account that we have of someone actually experimenting with manned flight. And it happened in the Middle Ages. In fact, in the period you could even call the Dark Ages, I suppose. And then he said afterwards, he was sitting up in hospital with 2 broken legs. He worked out what he needed to do was put a tail on it, and was going. So he was going to go do it again until he's. So yeah, this is experiment, right? I didn't get it right the first time, but his abbot said, "I'm afraid I can't have my young monks like launching themselves off the Abbey church and nearly killing themselves." So, from an occupational health and safety policy point of view, you know,
OSHA in the what century was this?
This is in the 11th century, about 1050. Oh no, probably a bit earlier, about 1040.
OSHA in the 11th century. Who knew? They were well ahead of their time.
Well,
this has been fascinating. I could sit through another 2 hours of this. We would definitely love to have you back on to you name the topic, and
Sure.
yeah, and definitely plug your material. Your website is also in the description. And could you, for the listeners, go ahead and you can talk about your website.
Okay, well, the blog that I mentioned before, it's History for Atheists, so historyforatheists.com or oneword.com. And it's effectively, as I said, I kind of got tired of debunking a lot of this stuff over and over again. So really it's a way of me saving some time. But it's got quite a following, and it's certainly been endorsed by some pretty serious scholars. Dame Avril Cameron, for example, recently endorsed it. I've recently discovered that at least 3 universities are using articles from it as part of their required reading on some of their history courses, which is pretty gratifying. But look, I want to say, I've got to say, look, I'm not a professional scholar. I'm simply curating the knowledge or the consensus of genuine scholars. I know you guys have got to finish up, so I'll finish up myself. Basically, what I would say is if anyone's got any questions or want citations of anything that I've mentioned, please contact you guys and you'll get in touch with me, and hopefully I can communicate that. And maybe if there's a topic that people are very interested in, I'd be happy to come back and talk again.
Yeah.
Cool.
We would love to have you. So I want to thank everyone for joining. I especially want to thank you, Tim, for being willing to come on.
Yes,
I have been a huge fan of yours for quite some time. So
Thanks, guys.
Yep, it was absolutely wonderful having you. And we're just going to say good night to everybody. Brian is probably going to be back on here tomorrow. I won't be. I unfortunately don't have a whole lot of time right now at university, but
actually, what we'll do is we'll do next week. We'll just say today was Sunday.
Okay,
it's Sunday somewhere. Oh, by the way, Tim O'Neill, is there anything from the future that you know that we can bet money on? Because we
since I'm sitting here in the future, I'd like to say Trump got impeached, but I'm afraid that's not true.
We won't shed any tears about that.
Yeah. Is there a sports almanac we can bet on that you have? Anyway.
Afraid it doesn't work like that. Okay. See you guys.
All right. Thank you, Tim.
All right.